Welcome to our newest member. As I wrote to you, Nikki Ruiz de Luzuriaga, phonetic, entirely phonetic.
There's criteria now for new people.
Yeah, right? We're going with complex morphology and phonics. Want to really welcome Nikki to the board and not at all new to the work itself. Nikki is the Vice President of Institutional Advancement at Empath, which is committed to moving families towards more sustainable income levels and education through a lot of different channels of important work. Nikki is in the parent seat and living it daily with an infant at home, so she's going to bring two lenses regularly to this work. Welcome, Nikki. Thank you for your commitment. To all of you, thanks for your flexibility. Realized last Tuesday morning, in a matter of an hour, there was no way we were going to hold a good, strong meeting with a quorum, so here we are today. We're going to keep with the agenda that we had in the beginning, and I will just say that I'll keep my comments very brief. I think we're moving at pace. Look forward to hearing about the strategic planning process. I think in many ways appreciate this approach to the budget and the process, thinking about where we are as board, as an agency in terms of the plans going forward, and really pushing on the priorities that will be associated with the budget rather than say specifically at this moment in time the line item recommended expenditures and investments. So look forward to hearing more about that. And to this work, again, just a refresher on sort of where I think we're at. We're looking at an early 2020 kind of set of strategic recommendations to come out of this process that will then drive a lot of work in across all of the channels, and I think especially give us a backbone by which to think about any one conversation or initiative. So with that, we'll be scheduling the retreat for sometime in February to really round up on where things are at. So thanks to everybody, and I'll turn it over, see if the secretary has any comment.
Nothing further, Madam Chair, other than to welcome Nikki again and thank you for being here. And I'm a little disappointed because I thought your infant was going to be with us.
And last Tuesday I thought, can you bring her?
Geez, okay. So we'll have to make arrangements so that can happen. It may be out of the sort of the cameras. If it's probably a little inappropriate. That's a good point. But anyway, thank you for doing. That's excellent.
She's 11 weeks.
Not old. But anyway, thank you for being here.
Nikki's eyes are open, and she's probably looking forward to a little adult conversation. So she's conflicting motivations here. All right, Commissioner, you're on.
So yes, welcome, Nikki. Really excited about the expertise you bring to the board, and I think it'll be a real welcome perspective to think about the work you do both professionally and the passion that you bring, and have enjoyed our conversation so far. Thank you all for all of the thoughtful engagement around the budget process and where we've headed towards this. I think most of our conversation today will spend some time looking at where the strategy is headed, and I think that as in any leadership role, one of the challenges I'd like to reflect on from the first 4 months is really that balance of how to really keep a foot in the tactical crisis fire putting out mode while also keeping an eye to the vision of where we're going and where the strategy is. And so I'm really excited today. I think as a lot of the conversations over the last couple of months have also been updating on operational tactics, to really spend some time today talking about what we're hearing from the field and how that's defining some of the strategic roadmap in progress, and where we'll spend a lot more deeper time together at the board retreat on that. I also want to point out that that's coupled with, which you'll hear a little bit about today, a process for us internally that will help, that we've brought on Guidehouse, which is a consultancy, the PricewaterhouseCoopers consultancy that focuses on public service public service sector. And that has actually been really, really helpful in taking some of what we're hearing externally internally and really translating that into the capacity and the investment we need to make in our own department to be able to really do that, to achieve those goals with integrity. And so excited to share a little bit about that today. But after having spent some time with the leadership staff yesterday talking through both the progress on the strategic plan and some of those, how do we balance that headed towards a bigger strategy with an operational structure that allows us to achieve our day-to-day operations, I think are really excited about the energy the leadership team is bringing to that in bridging those two conversations so that we really do live across both of those two priorities as a department. So I was excited to highlight that. We still, of course, have a number of changes in process, and we'll not spend a ton of time today in the tactical operations, but wanted to make sure also that as we think about budget, if there are questions around where some of the impact of those investments are, and that happy to discuss that too. So I think that's mostly where I wanted to start, and then today I'll spend a lot more time up in front of you talking through some of the specifics.
Great. Could I ask those on the phone to introduce themselves? I'm sorry, I missed that process point in the beginning. Thank you all for joining and for your flexibility.
Hi, this is Eleonora Villegas Reamer.
Mary, you there?
Very well, okay.
Great. Thank you all. And when we go to take a vote, we'll be sure to call on you and have you remind us who you are and then vote. That's as close to a law degree as I get. So let's move now to some routine business. I don't think we have any public comment today, this afternoon. So in that vein, let's move to the minutes from the October 8th meeting. Any amendments to the minutes? Errors, corrections? They looked fine to me. Everybody good? All right, just make the motion that we approve the minutes of the October 8th, 2019 board meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Abstained or opposed? Thank you. Eleonora, did you want to go ahead and give us an update on the program committee's latest meetings?
Sure. I think that the update is quick because what we did in the committee is two topics that we're going to be discussing today in great detail.
Great. Okay.
So one is we spent a long time discussing budget and budget priorities and how to think about the budget process. And then we spent a lot of time also looking at the strategic plan and the feedback that we had received from the field up until that time, and how we're going to use that feedback as we continue to progress in developing the strategic plan and the implementation plan.
Great.
So I think that was most of the meeting was spent that way, and I think that we're going to hear about it today later on.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Looking forward, and thank you for your commitment to that work. All right. So let's move into our full agenda item for discussion and action. We've got two votes. We're going to start with the Section 92 report. Somebody will give us a quick briefing on that.
Yep.
And you've got the report itself also in your binder.
Yeah, and I will just highlight as Sean starts is that we did spend some time with the field on this and trying to get some feedback on what would be most relevant in terms of enhancing the report. So Sean will highlight some of that, the feedback that we got and how we tried to respond to it.
Great. Good afternoon. This will be a brief presentation that will hopefully provide some background information as the board votes on the outside Section 92. Just by a quick way of background, sorry, I have that clicker. Oh, thanks. So I'm going to quickly jump ahead. Just way of background, Section 92 refers to outside Section 92 of Chapter 41 of the Acts of 2019, also known as the FY20 budget. In that section requires the Executive Office of Administration and Finance to submit a report to the legislature on expenditures related to the objectives of the CCDBG block grant. The report must be approved by the board, and this is the sort of the second phase of that, the second requirement. So this document that you had before you is really in two has two components. The first one is really, as the commissioner mentioned, after the board voted on and approved the previous report in September, which was submitted in October, the EC, specifically the commissioner, reached out to the field just to see is there any other areas they want us to address in the subsequent and final report today. And based on that feedback, we try to make the first part sort of look at the relationship between CCDBG funding and caseload expenditures specifically. The second part, again, is in the appendix. It really is the report you voted on a few months back with just updated numbers with state fiscal year 19 was finalized, so that's what's reflected in that. And I should reiterate that this report also addresses, again, all the mandated questions in the section. So this is sort of just like a little bit of a new twist just to look at caseload. So in the first part, the document before you contains a great amount of detail regarding caseload and the funds that support the expenditures from these accounts. The purpose of this slide and maybe this presentation is to offer just some highlights on the information before you. So before we jump into sort of the state expenditures, just for a frame of reference, CCDBG in how it relates to caseload and federal funds, over 73% of our caseload expenditures each year, using FY19 as sort of like the benchmark. The combined expenditures with the TANF, the DTA account, supportive, and income eligible, about 73% are reimbursed through the TANF block grant and CCDBG. So just give you a sort of an idea of the scope of what funding does for the caseload accounts. And overall, about 95% of our expenditures, caseload expenditures, are CCDF eligible for reimbursement. And it's about 53% is eligible for TANF reimbursement. So with that sort of frame of reference, getting back to sort of the actual expenditures each year, we sort of looked at a 5-year snippet from FY16 up to projected FY20. And aside from a small blip in 17 to 16 where there was a slight decrease of about 3%, each year caseload expenditures go up significantly. In FY19, for example, I think went about 7% over 18. And in this year, it's going to exceed the state fiscal year 20. Caseload expenditures will surpass FY19 by well over 10%. That's what we're on track for. And it's probably going to be much higher than 10%. But again, like I mentioned earlier, a large percentage of those expenditures are reimbursed through the TANF block grant and also the CCDF. But that leaves a gap, and that gap is really filled by state general revenue. And notwithstanding, we had a significant increase, as you know, in FY18 with CCDF funds, about $30 million, which helped sustain some of the growth in caseload, specifically the rate increases. But whatever the growth, but the growth with the state general fund revenue is actually outpacing that growth in terms of supports for caseload expenditures. So notwithstanding the $30 million increase, caseload is still skyrocketing, and much of that increase is supported with general revenue dollars. So that's sort of like a look at sort of caseload in a highlight version. And again, the appendix just sort of goes back to the previous report we gave with just updated numbers. Is there anything I can answer with caseload expenditures now in CCDF?
And I just want to clarify, the reason that our numbers are updated is because when we put forward the report to you in September, they were still closing out the FY19 books, and so these are actuals now that we're a couple of minutes later. So I just wanted to clarify the update specifically.
Just one little snippet. I mean, in the updates were really marginal. There was about, for TANF was a swing of $5 million. For general revenue, about $1 million. So it's really just sort of marginal increases, but we want to reflect actuals in the report.
Sean, I just want to better understand what you're saying about the relationship between expenditures and caseload. You said that caseload significantly increased, but my understanding is that our numbers are roughly stable and are perhaps dipping a little bit, but not on the dollar side, on the services side, because we know that we have essentially more expensive slots over time, right? So can you just help clarify that relationship?
If yes, being specific towards a caseload number, is the actual number of kids served has stayed somewhat stable. I think, top of my head, I think it's about 53,000, and it's ranged to 53 and 55. We keep IE vouchers open. We try to sustain a level. I think it was 21,665, which I'm sure Carol can correct me if I'm off by one. But I mean, I think we usually try to keep access open. And to your point, expenditures do increase. There's rate increases. I mean, I think the board has looked at about well over $100 million in the past 4 years of rate increases that they have voted on and approved, and the governor has funded. So to your point, much of the increases relate to rate increases that we've gone through.
Thank you.
I mean, that's not the entire thing, but the majority of it is related to rate increases.
I'm just going to say, we do control that to a certain extent by how we open up income eligible or close it down, right?
Absolutely.
Other questions or comments? All right, thanks, Sean. Let me make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care hereby approves pursuant to Section 92 of Chapter 41 of the Acts of 2019, the Executive Office for Administration and Finance report describing CCDBG expenditures as mandated within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts FY 2020 state budget. Second, sorry, thank you, Carolyn. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, those on the phone, I'm sorry. Mary Wallachie?
Yes.
David Cruz?
Yes. Yes.
Eleonora Villegas Reimers?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Let's move now to an update on the strategic planning process, which is before the budget in the agenda for obvious reasons, which is to say it sort of exactly fits where we're at with the budget process as well. And so it's a good segue. So we'll have the commissioner provide that update.
Hi. Okay, so as the chairman said, that really it is intentional to have the strategic action planning conversation before the budget because we are using this information, which we're about 35 to 40% of the way through the process to help inform how the budget priorities are coming along. So I wanted to spend some time this morning updating everyone on where we were in this. Thank you all for those of you who've been able to be present and attend some of the community meetings. I think it has been incredibly impactful to be out in the community, hearing some of the feedback and really translating some of the operational changes that we've seen at the department, and that the magnificent team here has really been spending time trying to implement with what the impact is in the field and really, quite frankly, the understanding of that in the field, of understanding what the goal and objectives are. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of it with some urgency today and have you all have time to be able to ask questions about where we might be or how we direct it from here. So if I got to figure out how to use a clicker first. Okay. So wanted to start with the planning engagement process, and as you will remember, we went over a lot of this at the last meeting and thinking about how we are planning this engagement. So this slide, which I know you've seen multiple times at this point, of really thinking that what does the path look like to get to a March meeting where we're approving a roadmap, and what does that roadmap look like? And so have spent through October and November engaging the field. We've had a number of community meetings and started to synthesize some of those into some learnings so that over this month and through January, we're going deep on a few topics that really thinks about what the priorities are, how those might be impacting the budget process and where some of the budget implications might be, and co-creating with the field what some of those solutions are that heads towards the completion of a roadmap that will outline what activities we want to engage in and what impact we intend those to have as we get towards, over the next few years, as we get towards a March approval date. So this is where we are in the process. I will There are key points in how we're trying to look at working with the field, really thinking about learning, and I'll talk a little bit about how much engagement. We've had really an overwhelming amount of engagement in this first stage of the process. So it's been an amazing opportunity to not only learn about the nuances of the sector across the Commonwealth, but also really about some of the implications and understanding of where we're headed. And then really thinking through engaging in that is, so as we have been able to call some of those lessons and themes that we've been hearing across all of this engagement, of returning to the field and have been iterating around this along the way, to be able to say, this is what we're hearing, is it right? Are we articulating this right? And as you can expect when you engage a field that has been undergone a lot of transition, the part of what we expect to hear in this is a lot of very specific concerns or challenges that people are confronting. And so as we turn those into solutions or understanding what the path forward is, it's an opportunity to go back and say, we've heard this concern. Is this the right path to help solve some of that? And that's as we pivot to December and January, are working into that co-created part. If this is the right direction for some of those solutions, this is where we're headed. So I want to give you an example of that around to make that very tangible. So what we hear a lot is around salaries, and I think you all have heard this as much as the country has heard it now around salaries in early childhood. But when we get down to it, EEC doesn't actually set the salaries at our independent nonprofits or businesses, small businesses that are employing the field. So when we get out there and we hear about the challenges across the Commonwealth around the challenges of salaries, and being able to ask questions at a deeper learning capacity of what is preventing you. It's not just money, that's one component, but it's actually a lot of complexity in there around the dependencies that the staff has on accepting public benefits because they have low salaries. So increasing benefits $1 or $2 at a time has a lot of cliff effects for our staff, as well as we look at that for our parents. So really being able to engage and dig deeper, that it's not just salaries at a massive, we need to think about this massive issue, but starting to break down what some of the real challenges are in being able to make an inroads on this really complex national issue in early childhood. And then as we pivot towards how we identify where the biggest levers EEC might be able to impact, of co-creating some of those solutions. So we're talking about actually financing structures and the impact that has on salary implications, as opposed to just the money itself. So those are some of, I wanted to give that example because I think when we think about how the iteration evolves and allows us to go deeper and try to find those innovations, I think that that's an area that has been really rich in conversation across all of these meetings. So as we look at the external world, I also wanted to give and I should say, I'm going to step one back before I go to this other one. In every single regional office and in central office, as we have gone to the field and engaged externally, we have spent time with the staff as well, thinking internally about what does this mean, what do we think we're going to hear, what are some of the translations and issues, and really reflecting on what we then need to do and reflect and spend time at our organization, within our organization, to define how we structure ourselves to achieve this goal. So the staff has been very involved in this first stage of learning and engaging with the field, with the expectation that we're now pivoting our staff time to spend more time looking internally, understanding where the biggest investments are, both in staffing capacity, but also in processes and procedures that would help us use that staffing capacity as effectively and efficiently as possible. So parallel to Eamon Arrow, who I believe most of you have been in touch with, who is the consultant working on our external strategic roadmap process, we've brought in the parallel process with the business system analysis, which we've, as I mentioned earlier, have contracted with Guidehouse on to conduct a system analysis to really supplement what we're seeing as the impact we want to have in the Commonwealth with what do our structures need to look like here to be able to achieve those. So Guidehouse is about a month into the process, maybe few days shy of a month at this point. They have been able to really dig deep so far, and I think this has been a real asset to really dig deep into our field offices and spend time interviewing people and understanding our current state, and have already identified areas where increased consistency across the Commonwealth would help us actually not only use our staff capacity more effectively, and as we think about scaling and bringing on new staff, would be necessary to make sure that they are most impactfully used as well. And so have already identified some of those areas and are helping us continue to evolve and define the current state so that we can co-create with the staff a future state of the organizational structure. So this has been a real, I will say, it has been I want to say an intentional surprise, but also a real surprise at how well these things have actually naturally just flown together. We intentionally started the external process a few weeks before the internal process, so we had external questions and the field impact being defined slightly ahead of where our internal capacity would need to be to achieve that impact. And as yesterday, as I mentioned, we brought the leadership team together. Really have been heartened by how well the messages, the themes, and quite frankly, just the engagement has really aligned so succinctly that we've been able to really, I think, we'll come out with an extremely rich and impactful process, both from an external and internal lens. So the framework that Guidehouse is using, I thought this would be just a good grounding point. Again, looking at the current state assessment and being able to then look towards a future state and implementation plan. They do use a people, process, and technology framework, which helps us really understand technology, as we were talking with the team yesterday, technology in service of making people and processes more efficient, as opposed to the solution we are pursuing. And so I think that this framework has been a real asset, not only to the analysis part, but also to understanding how all three of these components need to fit together in our discussions with the team in order to make sure we're leveraging all of our resources as effectively as possible. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, of course.
So are they available for the development and implementation of the technology, or is this mostly just the planning and what we need?
For the technology part. So we can talk a little bit about that a little bit more specifically in the budget process and where the investment might be made. Right now, we've contracted with Guidehouse through April just to do the design and implementation planning. I know that some projects have continued on and continued to fund them to do some of the implementation. We haven't looked at that decision-making process at this point yet. And I think that particularly when you're talking about I think that stands across all the people, processes, and technology. When you're talking about the technology implementation specifically, honestly, they're not focusing too much on that part of it, and that the conversation of what implementation and design would look like is in collaboration with Executive Office of Education as well.
We might want to talk about it later, but I noticed it's about an $8 million ask, and I wonder if we're taking a look at CCFA, all the challenges and roadblocks that came up there, and trying to learn from some of those experiences.
Absolutely.
To make sure we have the support we need.
Yep.
We got to get this right the first time or second time or something.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and I think that ultimately what Guidehouse has highlighted already, which is symptomatic in some of our technology too, is the room for improved integration across our different units. And so I think the technology, looking at technology investments in service of that as well, is part of the staging and sequencing we need to do to make sure that our technology, we're not relying on our technology to fix the silos, that we are looking at our people and processes that need to help break that down, that then technology helps us serve. So yes, it's on the radar, but we haven't quite gotten to that level of solutioning yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, so any other questions on this part? Because I'm going to pivot to what we've been hearing from the field, but I'm more than happy to answer other questions if people have them on this part. Okay. So what we're hearing from the field. So we have done a regional meeting in every regional office, including central office. We have sent out a survey, and actually this PowerPoint numbers you have are from last week. Our updated numbers is that we had over 500 people at our in-person at our community learning sessions, and those you also know we did a survey that went out across the field that we encouraged people to bring to existing meetings that they had so that we could capture a number of voices through a single point, so that people didn't all feel like they had to be in person in order to have their voices heard. So as of yesterday, we have over 700 surveys that actually represent over 11,000 voices from the field, so from across the Commonwealth. So I think that we've gotten some extremely rich data, big data, as I've told people along the way. That was the point of this, is to get as much data as we could, qualitative data, but as much data as we could as quickly as possible, so that we understood where the themes that we should dig deeper on. The survey does not close, but we did do a final push last week because we did do our data poll this morning, I believe, and we'll be looking at those 700 surveys, which all are open-ended questions, to start to build some themes and some of that deeper level. You'll see some of those from the first 400 or 500 surveys today that we're seeing, but continue to do a much deeper analysis of that over the next 2 weeks as we are continuing to engage the field on specific efforts. Yes?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Of those 711,000,
Mhm.
I think remarkable.
Mhm.
Do you have any idea of the percentage of folks, I know you have here families, for-profit and nonprofit, but of those, how many are Head Start providers, family child care, public
Yeah.
school?
We have a little bit of that information. We do have some of that information, but not all of it, since we did encourage people to bring it to. So a Head Start provider might be filling it out on behalf of their parent policy council or their community as well. And so it's rough numbers, but we have a little bit of that. What we have spent a lot of time is to make sure that we have diversity of voices from each region so that we didn't see a concentration. So we do know that we have from all of the populations that you mentioned, or all of the stakeholders that you mentioned, across regions, we have some distribution in each region of each of them.
Thank you.
Other questions on that? Okay. And I should say also on the families, we have had a surprising number of families actually respond, and the themes that are coming out of that are great. We have also been working closely with the PDG team and the Strategies for Children team, because they are doing a family survey as well as the Federal Reserve has done a bunch of family focus groups, and there's a number of efforts out there. So our target audience that we spent a lot of time getting the survey out to was not families. It was people who worked with families. And while we're excited to have families there, we expected these other initiatives to do a much more targeted approach with families than we intended to do here. So that data will be supplemented and aggregated across, but I just wanted to be intentional because I know that question has come up a number from our stakeholders, is the family representation in here. Okay, so, and you see full rooms at literally every regional office that we were at. It was really remarkable, and I think that one thing I would like to highlight here, and you'll hear it a little bit later as well, is the appreciation of the field to come out and listen and have this time to engage has been, quite frankly, just overwhelming for me personally, because our consultant, Eli, who you've all talked to, spent every meeting saying at the end, like, we're going to cut this group conversation off, but I've actually seen Sam stay for hours afterwards, so she's welcome to do, we'll have a lot of conversations, but the willingness of people to engage and constructively think towards a vision for the field has been really remarkable in this. So I wanted to give an update on where we are in the discovery process and percentage of completion. Again, these are last week's numbers, and the team is diligently working away, so you can expect that much of this has increased. But our stakeholder engagement, as you see, increased numbers from what you have here, but are really pretty much done with our in-depth interviews, our learning tours, and our engagement. And you see there represented. The MPIT is the Massachusetts Partnership for Infants and Toddlers that's run through Strategies for Children, and so that is the parent engagement survey you see there. The background research, again, we've been looking at all the plans and reports. The survey had an opportunity to upload any documents that had been relevant to people who were filling that out. We've also gotten a number of emails, and so really looking across those finding themes, analyzing, reviewing, and synthesizing. They've looked at, our consultants have looked at our budget, have looked at the community level data and trends, and looked at both national research and Massachusetts research. So we're really continuing to plow along on the background research that will inform this as well. And then the field research is set around really thinking around promising and best practices. I think that that 75% probably actually fluctuates up and down every day, as I have an idea on call. I'm like, can you see if there's any like infographic on this out there that would help us relevant? So they've been very responsive to some of the field research as things are emerging from the stakeholders in the Commonwealth of helping us contextualize what state and national plans are already tackling some innovation on this. So we're not recreating the wheel, but rather adapting some of that to our context.
Sam,
Yes.
when you're talking in the I know, thank you. The last piece about field research in the last bullet there, when we're tracking progress over time, what are we looking at?
So I think this is exactly where the next couple months will be delving deeper into, because what we want the roadmap to come out with is both some of those places where we can either shore up support for the field, identify innovation that will fix some of the problems, and really how do we know in quick order that those are working. So I think we're looking at a balance of what does it look like to track children and families, and what does it look like to track systems changes, and what is appropriate at all those levels developmentally and from an implementation science around where our initiatives are to track progress across all of those. So
I think that's key.
it's both, yeah, it's all of. And I think that this is where foreshadowing ahead some of the work with DESE too is really understanding the children served in the early years and in after school programs as part of a continuum of care that all lead towards a long-term outcome, and we need to understand how we're on track towards that long-term outcome for children and families, but that we don't use that as a punitive way, but understanding how we move children into a system long-term. Yeah. So we are looking at national benchmarks on that. We're looking at national models. And for those of you who are engaged in that or have ideas, please feel free to keep sending those along, because we're continuing to delve deep onto that. Okay. So hot off the presses last week, although this week it's a week off the presses, of emerging themes and early findings that we're hearing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the population analysis, what we're seeing in terms of the field and what that might impact in terms of some of our strategic decision making, the department level analysis, what we're looking in terms of where our impact is and where it could be, and then I think spend a little bit more time on what we're hearing from the surveys and from the field directly, and I'll give you an overview of how we've done some of that engagement in a little bit more granularity. So as you see, this is nationally, child populations are declining and birth rates are declining. And so Massachusetts certainly mirrors this national trend and sees that we are seeing a decline in birth rates. But I think that one of the things as we've looked into this data is this is not to say we need less services, because when you look at the department impact, it's not that we're even serving all of the children we could be serving. But I think that it does call on us, and what we've said in every public meeting around this is that that distribution and the demographics of that declining population is changing as well. And so as we have looked at a more racially and ethnically diverse population, and that the distribution of the decline is not consistent across the Commonwealth, that different regions have different rates, birth rates, that really thinking for us about how we use data to update our systems and to look at our impact in a more granular way is what we're using this data and population shifts for, not to justify services or not, but to really understand how we need to respond to a changing landscape of children and families as well with our systems. I think that the other question that comes up a lot in this in national trends is really around the reason for birth rates. We don't have any Massachusetts specific data on this, but the New York Times has done a number of analyses, surveys, questions around the reason people nationally are not having as many children. And pretty consistently there is economic reasons, is that it is expensive to have children. And I think that that is an area where should inform our work going forward also is how the reason why and where pressures on families having children really detract from some of the goals we're trying to achieve for them. And so, yeah, Sheila.
I was just going to say, also recognizing the linguistic and cultural diversity in regions.
Yep, absolutely.
One from another.
Absolutely. And that is certainly data we've been spending time with and understanding then as we pivot again, we look more towards some of the budget conversation we want to have around the cost of the services, high-quality services being delivered depends on what the services need or the service need is for the community. And so how we look at regional differentiation based on some of those demographic trends is how I think we need to also look at our, use this data going forward to inform our impact. Other questions on that? Okay. So I think that we still see, obviously, the potential of the return on investment in early childhood is huge, and we see all the research on that. And we have definitely, this board has really had a key role in trying to prioritize quality and understanding that the investments that we make in low-income children are really done in a way that drives towards that research. And we are really seeing in Massachusetts ranks in second in terms of the nation in terms of child well-being, which is great. I also think when we break down some of those specific indicators that there is still room to grow and a continuous quality improvement to make sure that we are doing better for children. One of the biggest things I think that we see a room for improvement on is, it goes back to our conversation about how we're tracking our progress, is how well we are preparing children to be successful in school, and those third grade reading scores where we still have half of our children not meeting third grade reading and math proficiency, and that isn't consistent across demographics and subgroups either. And so using that data to not only think about how we look at our services and where we need to invest, but then also ensuring that that we really are investing in a way that drives towards the outcomes we need and want to see for children and families.
Underscore that and
Please.
Tell you that I really appreciate you talking about children's outcomes in the long run. I mean, 8 years is not a long run, but it is when we're looking at what we're doing. And I very much appreciate you looking at that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that the field really across the Commonwealth in various ways have been asking for that, right? Like people want the early childhood field and the after school field, RMP being a slightly different population that we serve, but with all of the field, want to understand how their work is having a long-term impact too. And so the more we can help link and design and articulate that continuum, I think that the field is asking for that as well. Our outcomes
to align with DESE.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and then really thinking about going, Joni, from your point of working across the field and cross departments on this, is that that there's some systems change, there's some substance systems change that we need to think about and really dig into, which is where you see some of that reflected in the budget priorities, but thinking about how we link up our investment in children and families and access and thinking about that access across the state participate in conjunction with the investments in quality and regulation, and really more intimately linking some of those so we can really track towards these long-term outcomes for children in a more substantial and meaningful way, and quite frankly traceable way, so that we're able to pivot if it isn't working, and not haven't put money into something that isn't having the impact we anticipate. And so those systems changes, I think, again, you see some of them reflected in some of the budget conversations, but will continue to evolve, and I think that's where a lot of our co-creation with the field around what does need to change, and making sure that this doesn't feel like it's being done to them, but with them, because as I have said every time I'm out in the field, it's great that EEC may want to change something, but quite frankly, we're all in this together, and our work doesn't function if we don't have partners in the field. And so really making sure that this innovation meets as many needs as possible in what is a pretty fragile field right now. So again, just highlighting that this is a data being used for an evolution, not to justify, oh, we have less kids, we don't need as many services, but really to talk about how do we use this data to inform our next phase of planning and strategy to meet community and family needs. So there, you guys feel free to keep jumping in and asking questions, but before I pivot to some of the departmental level analysis, is there any questions on that? Okay. And sorry, on the phone, feel free to jump in. So moving on to slide 11 of this, of looking at the department level analysis, is that you actually see, and some of our initial data that we'll spend more time with at the retreat, have shown that in real dollars, the line item investments over the last 15 years have stagnated or decreased somewhat in EEC, and we'll have more data to be able to articulate that. But I think that what you do see is that the majority of our funding does go towards these financial subsidies for low-income families or otherwise qualified families into our child care subsidy. So when we look at changes in our subsidy rates, or we look at changes in our parent fee structures or something like that, it is a pretty substantial, those minor increases actually, given the percentage of the budget that represents, is a pretty substantial financial impact. And so those are some of the conversations as we talk about budget. These really, the changes that we need to make on the financing and the subsidy side will have to be taken with the budget analysis in a pretty serious way, given the size of that represents from our budget. To also say that that even with a declining birth rate nationally, the need far outweighs what we have in resources. And so there are critical decisions that have to be made in that. The amount of investment that would go from where we are to having a universal child care system in the country is pretty significant. And so really looking at, if we have about 40% of our EEC subsidies that go to school-age children, about 25 that go to infant toddlers, how do we set priorities around some of those financial assistance models that will help us drive towards a community landscape that bolsters the full suite of services children need, birth through early elementary. So,
Commissioner, can you just clarify your definition for school age? Just
kindergarten and above.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yep.
Just a quick question. Are any of the family surveys that are currently going out into the field trying to do a better estimate of family demand?
The Federal Reserve has been spending a fair amount of time actually trying to assess where the demand is and how parents are making choices. I think that the challenge with assessing parent demand is that they have found, and having conversations with them, and I know some of the national research has found, is that demand for some services are lower because of cost, and that the demand is often dependent on information in the community. And so I say that in that, right, I would choose X, but it is $25,000 or $30,000 a year that I don't have. Or I am not sure what I would choose, and so I ask my trusted advisor, my hairdresser, my librarian, my aunt, whatever, about childcare, and that's driving my demand. So it's a little bit hard to detangle, is what they're finding in that. But there are some efforts trying to dig deeper into that and understand choices.
We we have some information, it's a couple of years old, more than a couple of years old, of the needs assessment that a number of communities have done in Massachusetts to look at demand and what challenges might be.
Yeah. And Jody, that's a good point. I think that one of the things that we've gotten pretty, and you see in our progress, we're still culling through them. One of the things that we've encouraged people to send is the local needs assessment that has a little bit better lens of demand, because the local community needs assessment have been able to are closer to parents, right? So, and so we've gotten some information on that, and trying to find some trends and data that might be able to do some cost modeling or modeling of demand from us through that too. Yeah.
I just have one other quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Your percentages of the financial assistance subsidies, have you put those on an equal unit, or those don't represent the magnitude,
No.
right? So the percent is the people receiving something,
Yes.
but the something may be much smaller or larger depending.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. This
I
is
think
just
that's
percentage of families. No, thank you
Yeah,
for
I think
clarifying
that's an
that.
important point when we're
Yeah.
looking at these percentages.
And Charlie, so just to take that to the next level of granularity, is that for school age, we pay lower rates.
That's the
and
thing,
so they
right?
represent a
Yeah.
different percentage of the budget than
Of
of
the
the families.
overall investment,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So it's not a one-for-one in terms
right,
of
right,
dollars.
right. Got it.
Mhm.
Thanks.
But I do think that this is the same, these kind of data points, as we mull over them and dig into them, should be used to help us define where we want to look at progress in terms of access and quality and investment as a Commonwealth. When we look at the overall landscape that we decide we want to be investing in, how do we use those as benchmarks for progress?
No question at all. And I really do think it's also equally important to break out the 0 to 6 and further the infant and toddler.
Absolutely.
If we think about pathways and experiences for families, and then this school age, which, as many of you know, I think it has to be looked at carefully in terms of the EEC portfolio.
Yeah.
I had a
Thank
question,
you.
too, on the 0 to 6, 40% of
Yeah.
low income. Are those eligible families? In other words, are they eligible because their parents are working or is that just in general?
Yeah, so that represents, all of the families in that funding are eligible.
They are.
That represents the total population of families, of children enrolled in our subsidy. Of those, 40% are school age. So all of them are eligible, but of our overall caseload, that is the percentage that goes to basically after school and out of school time programs.
And Sheila, one of the
Or
things
children.
that Sam and I have talked about is, of that percentage, that's only a piece of our kids in the
Right.
state, that we have another 70-ish percentage of kids
Exactly.
that we
Yep.
are not touching right
Yeah.
now, but some of our programs do,
Yeah.
but not the subsidies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a good point of conversation as we dig deeper, is to understand that we, as a department, have a dual obligation to look at both what is offered to all children through licensing, QRIS type structures, things like that, that are setting benchmarks for educator qualifications that impact children whether they receive our subsidies or not, and have an obligation to think about access for low-income families through our subsidy rates. And so how we hold both of those roles and negotiate with the board how we make decisions across both of those things in terms of resource allocation, in terms of outcomes we expect to see, I think is really going to be the conversation we need to grapple with over the next few months as we define a roadmap and the progress we really want to make on this. Yeah, and then Sean already pointed out this last point, so I won't spend too much time on it, but we still do have a fairly heavy federal investment, and as the program committee discussed in more detail, is that when we look at that, we do see, I'm going to try to poorly quote Joan on this, so you can correct me, but we do see that at federal forecasting shows that that the percentage of federal funds that will be taken up by health-related investments is going to grow, and so there is federal forecasting that that anticipates that you will not see growth in other places given that. So, Joan, please correct me when I got that wrong, but generally direction is is there. Feel free to correct.
Not a correction at all, just to sort of, I think, augment that. what we're seeing at local, state, and federal budgetary levels are a series of pressures, healthcare being one, but also Social Security and pensions and debt relief service, that are putting enormous budgetary pressures in place and really leaving less and less available to do things like education and social services that we know the children and families that we most directly serve need and rely upon. At the same time, we have an increasingly acute trend in terms of the intensity of need that kids are coming into programs and schools with. And so really figuring out, as you're saying, how to evolve our services landscape so that we can better address the needs of children and families. We've got to get more efficient and effective with what we've got, or we're going to truly lose a generation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that calls on us to then spend time in this world where we can set what progress do we want to make, do we anticipate and feel will be the most impactful in there, because we are going to have to make critical choices, as all public entities do, and being able to make sure that we're doing that in line with a vision and a goal for the children of the Commonwealth, I think is really what we're hoping this helps come out with. Okay, moving on, happy to answer questions along the way. Feel free to interrupt. But in the meantime, you have here just the survey questions that were asked to the field. I want to just provide those because I wanted to make sure you knew what we were reacting to when we start looking at the data. But as you can see, pretty open-ended questions asking about what's going right, where's the room for improvement, where do you need more support, and really what do you think should be the impact we should be looking at trying to target in the next 5 years. So here's our preliminary analysis. Again, this is last week's analysis, so we continue to have evolution, but you see that those first four components that pretty much held true across the different populations that we were looking and responded to the survey are really a lot in line with where we were seeing the budget priorities play out too. So there's a lot of alignment there. We tried to pull from some of this, but really looking at, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on a couple of these elements and then we'll go into some of the themes. But that TA for support and providers includes really making sure that the financing mechanisms are there so that support is both in financial and in technical assistance support that was called out. And again, I want to highlight that it's financing. It's not just financial. So it's not just more money. It's the conversation came up with it's how and where and how you incentivize and use that money that is as important as more money. Licensing and regulatory improvements. I think there was a number of things that came up consistently that would help us spend some time looking at our regulations in totality. There has pretty consistently come up that we've evolved components of our regulations over the last few years, but to look at them cohesively, the way a program has to respond to them would be a benefit before we look at trying to make some more improvements in there. And so we've been thinking and looking at that in terms of the agency's objectives and roadmap as well. Looking at both the staff retention and recruitment, I think this has been pretty consistently twofold. Looking at both our own EEC staff retention and recruitment so that we have the capacity to respond to the field has been a pretty consistent message, but as well as how we set up incentives and set up systems that help the early childhood education staff and human service, because it's not just early childhood, it is also that after school, out of school time, and RMP has the same question of high staff turnover rates and really needing to think about recruitment and retention strategies in ways that the Commonwealth can support and EEC can support overall. And go deeper into that, but. And then really thinking about what does access to quality mean, and that is, really thinking about how do we universally define quality, and then how do we both define but then implement that definition in a way that builds a ladder for people to engage in continuous quality improvement. So I'm going to spend time on the themes from stakeholder engagement here, and this is really what we're starting to hear. We'll spend a lot more time in the next month and a half to dig deep with this and a few other things we'll bring to the board retreat after having a little bit more engagement with the field. So there is pretty universal desire to think about how all of the programming, all of the initiatives, both within EEC and outside EEC that impact our programs and children and families that we work with, are impacting those that are trying to reconcile multiple different funding streams, multiple different monitoring agencies, all of that. So I think from an internal to EEC, this pairs very closely with the Guidehouse work of thinking about the customer journey through our program. Our services and initiatives, and understanding how we can simplify that process to make it easier for, regardless of our customer, whether we're talking about a family, an educator, or a program level stakeholder, that all of those come cohesively together to build a whole vision that a person can tap into. And then I think also looking at our sister agencies. And I will say, I know that there has been some awesome inroads and reflected in some of the budget memo too, with agencies, with DCF and DTA, and thinking about how we can do some coordination around high need populations. What was coming out most specifically in the field over and over again was around K-12 as well, and thinking about how the trajectory of a child's development across birth through 8 could be supported by the full suite of services EEC can coordinate. So around workforce, financing, access, funding, curricular and instructional alignment, of really spending time thinking about the dimensions that need to be coordinated so that a family's experience could be as seamless as possible. And that would incorporate the DCF and DTA work that we have been doing, but be beyond that and really intentional with K-12 as well. Really thinking about the regulations, as I said, and I spent a little time on this. So, on what is the interaction between the regulatory requirements and how an agency experiences that consistently across the Commonwealth, as well as that we are prioritizing the most important things for not only the health and safety, but the education and the development of children, and support for families. And we have been able to, the wonderful thing about these in-person sessions has been, at least for me, I'm not sure all the staff loves living in this place with me, but the place of being able to balance the vision of where we're going and the very practical concerns and regulations that stand in the way for people to help achieve that. And so we have been growing a list of areas where we need to ask ourselves critical questions. If the field if we've been hearing themes from the field that these are standing in the way of some real impactful work that they are doing, how do we reconcile the intent it was supposed to serve and the barrier it is actually demonstrating on the ground? So that, I think, is part of what we will look for in the next phase, is also understanding all of these improvements that were made in our regulations to come into compliance with the federal regulations, but also then understanding and spending some time with the field to understand the comprehensive and cohesive lens that has to be for them to be able to respond accordingly. And then again, this plays in specifically to the quality, that there is a vast difference of interpretation on what is quality, what should be prioritized, and how we should be getting there. I think this is not unique to Massachusetts. This is a challenge across the field. But then understanding not only how do we outline what that is, but even more importantly, how do we incentivize, operationalize, and support people to implement that in a way that that allows them to feel supported in this continuous quality improvement process. So we will also be looking at that. And I think that what we heard over and over again, and what some in-person meetings allowed us to detangle, is the real complexity of quality is about workforce investments. It is about career pathways. It is the quality isn't one component. It is everything wrapped around and seen as a full puzzle that allows agencies and providers to be able to effectively engage in the kind of quality that we would hope and expect for children and families. And then I spent some time on this. So the workforce challenges is that this is real complex, that people need, regardless, not specialized services, but everyone needs across all of our programming and in every single region and every single role, the ability to think about how we incorporate social emotional development, that the mental health and the trauma-informed practice that isn't a specialized role but is embedded across everyone's role, I think was a real, to go to Joan's earlier point, is that as families are showing up with complex needs, making sure that whoever is working with them really has the ability to help address those and think about that. The needs as comprehensive is not only about the wraparound supports, but also is about the training and education for our workforce.
And let me just add to that
please.
and say it actually goes back to your previous bullet, which is it's not just the people, it's the features of the learning environment itself, right, that also matter tremendously. So the extent to which we have really strong routines and processes, we're high on cognitive press, right, to kind of reduce stress and anxiety around. And so I want it to not necessarily just be about what do I, the educator, know, but what actually are the features of this setting
Absolutely.
that will be preventive in nature as well.
Yeah, and those of you who live in the South Coast may have heard me say this. I said this at a keynote that I gave there, but my most profound real life experience of that is being a mental health consultant and going in and being asked by teachers over and over again to work with this one child. And as you start to understand, okay, routines of the day and all of the challenges there, recognize that one of the most impactful things is after months of working with them was the child dysregulated around the same time every day because he didn't know who was picking him up. So the complexities of that, of understanding the mental health components of what was happening there, right, of a dysregulation because of an unknown trigger and a trauma that probably represented him, but that teachers needed to understand that as part of their routine and their instruction, and that the director needed to understand that as part of the family engagement, and all of that connection is much more of a comprehensive learning environment approach, as opposed to what I was asked to do was like, come and deal with this kid, right? Like, so I'd go in and really understanding the complexities of that, I think is what providers are grappling with every day, and are often asking for, come deal with this kid, because they don't have the resources to be able to address the complexity of needs. And so that's what I think we're hearing in the field too.
Yeah. You also have a literature where the largest effect size on reducing behavior problems and externalizing behaviors has to do with opportunities to respond at the sort of cognitive linguistic level. That means a kind of design, right, that gets kids really engaged with their day-to-day work, if you will.
And also, Noni, as early educators, we know that the classroom is another teacher.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right.
Just knowing that.
Absolutely.
Service, in-service TA perspective helps with the other services coming in as well.
Yep. Yep.
And one last comment. This is partly why I worry a great deal sometimes about stopping at standards, because implementation is everything. And it's very hard to implement a set of standards without real significant scaffolds for the system that include the materials, that include the plans and the coaching and the professional learning around standards. But like, what is that day-to-day social emotional standards and language development, cognitive development?
And what are the instructional strategies?
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that is, I think that is the questions as we ask ourselves, and we pivot to the board, the budget conversation too, is that the development of the standards, the development of some of that infrastructure has to be coupled with what do we do and what do we coach, what's the technical assistance around those that are that deep implementation. And so as we are, as we're at a point right now where there's development, where we are midway through some development of the standards, we're also asking and have to ask both with the community, with the board, and with the staff of, okay, so to what end are we developing these? Like, what gets done with them afterwards? And I think that those are, those are questions I think need to also be coupled with, and what is the accountability for us for programs around that to what end? So those are all, I think, the really complex questions that lay ahead of us with this.
This question,
Of course.
unrelated, or I guess it must be related in some way. But
It's all related,
Different
Secretary.
category. In the survey, the question around family education and support, or the category of family education and support, is number 2 for families, not surprisingly, and much lower for everybody else. And while on the one hand, you could imagine, or you would assume, that this issue is deeply connected to what's going on with providers and what kind of relationship they have with their families and what kind of information and education and support they're providing to them. But is there something else that's embedded in this, and it doesn't really pop out of the 4 things that you just talked about that we ought to be at least keeping in the backs of our mind as a priority?
No, thank you for calling that out, and I think that it does link to some of where the conversation was going, where the budget conversation went too, because we called it out there. I think that it is. The conversation we pretty consistently heard, and there were a number of families who showed up to the in-person work, so I've spent much more time talking with them than I have looking at the survey results at this point. The conversation we heard was the family engagement within programs was important, but it was the community level understanding and engagement and resources around what could they pull down to help communicate with parents who weren't engaged in the program, not only to help them get engaged in program, which was one dynamic, but really to focus on their development, their child's development. And I think pretty resoundingly what we heard was, and this again follows national research on this too, it was this person who brought me here tonight who was the most impactful mechanism for me understanding how talking to my child mattered, right? And so I think that what we heard pretty much consistently from families in terms of the kind of education and support they wanted was, how do we build the community capacity to find more of those people who connect with those parents who need it and provide that human interaction that help them change their behavior. I don't want to say behavior change in bad, improve their engagement with their child, right? And so I think that was pretty resoundingly, the family education and support was not just information, it was really emphasis on some of that support level and not just the education level. Does that answer your question?
It does, although I guess my not a question to be answered, but just something for us to keep thinking about is the extent to which, I mean, it's easy for us and natural for us to be focused on programs as sort of the place in which we engage with parents, really, as an agency. On the other hand, the more sort of informal or community-based or non-program initiatives, home visiting being a good example of this, may be as important, or in some cases more important, even though it's harder to measure and harder to control or manage. So anyway, all that is simply to say that I think there's an area of opportunity here, especially given, we were talking about the 40% of families that we're actually touching and 60% who were not, that figuring out how to take the most advantage of that and create the most leverage for those families, especially those who, may be going through challenges of their own of various kinds. It seems to me, again, something that we need to keep thinking about and working on.
Yeah, and I do think that pretty consistently across both what we've heard in the survey, and Joni, you can probably speak a little bit more detail to this, and people who showed up at the forums, the learning sessions, those coordinated family and community engagement grantees that cover. I know, thank you. I was like CFCE, but I'm trying not to use as many acronyms because it took me so long to learn them myself over the last 4 months. Saw them as the resource that could be some of that. So most universally, when a parent walked in and said, I and said I had an impact I needed to come and tell you about, it was about a CFCE provider. Sometimes it was about a home visiting offering that they were doing, but a lot of times it was a play group or just like they were a knowledgeable person and I didn't know. I mean, I literally, the picture you see up there is this woman who came with her daughter to tell me the whole story about the CFCE provider who didn't do home visiting but got her connected to a home visiting provider. But really that she said my child wasn't going to be ready for kindergarten and now was the top, I think that week she was the top student or something. But I think those kind of impactful stories are exactly what you're saying, is how do we think about the infrastructure needed at the community level outside of our programs that provide inroads and help with that navigation role as well. Yep, and we'll get there. Yeah, I think that is really important. Okay, so I mean, I talked a lot about the workforce challenges throughout this, so I don't want to belabor some of the themes you guys have heard as well. But I think that I do want to highlight really quickly the system navigation component of that, the workforce challenges, is that part of what, and this goes to our own internal capacity to help people navigate multiple systems that they have to engage with in order not only to become qualified, but also then to enhance their consistency. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead to the next one. To enhance their credential or education requirements to be able to move up a career lattice. And so really needing help to help find those day-to-day, not only at the educator level, but the program level to help really support our workforce in achieving this. I said this before, but I cannot express enough how many times continued engagement of this sort in the field really came up, and so really are thinking with all of you and look forward to the board retreat where we can find ways that we can sustain this kind of engagement that will really continue to bring the voice of the field into these conversations as well. Okay, so we've started to coalesce around some specific opportunities for the strategic plan and the strategic roadmap, but we'll spend a lot more detail with this, and so I don't want to, this is just sort of a highlight and a peek into what we're going to spend the next few months really digging into, but really thinking about the stability and support for families, or in EEC that will actually support families. You see these reflected in the budget memo too. Define quality improvement pathways and thinking about how we not only have that in concept on paper, but actually push that into an implementation mode that is accessible and understandable by the field. Engage in regulatory and finance reforms, as I said, really thinking about the simplicity, consistency, and identifying the effectiveness that we want that's standing in the way. Talking about feedback loops, and then really thinking about that integrated approach and ways that we operationalize the integration. You have our next steps here that outline the key meetings coming up, but December 17th, I want to highlight, we'll be doing a joint meeting with the Workforce Council, the Advisory Council, and the Program Committee of the Board to dig much deeper, sort of a retreat style, to dig much deeper into what we've heard back, and specifically as it relates to the programming components. We won't be talking as much on the financing there, and looking at operationalizing this quality and this program conversation with the field that will allow us to bring some more substantive work back to the board for more clarity and implementation. Continue to collect information. And to dig deep into this, we'll be doing a similar conversation around the cost of quality, where we'll be able to gather information from the field and then bring back some of what we've aggregated to the field in January to ask some questions about how it's resonating and how we're building that. And then again, thinking about headed towards a board retreat, February. That February 6th is a tentative date, so you'll see some questions. Right now, it's captured there because we want to set ourselves a benchmark and deadline. But we'll be looking to do that and then go back out to the community with something that the board has worked on creating with us to make sure that we're on feedback, on track with articulating solutions that work for them. That's where we are. Absolutely.
Other last comments or questions? I mean, certainly a segue to the budget, and I do want to make sure we keep moving here, move the agenda along. But any last comments or questions on this? Thank you, Commissioner. It's a lot of good, strong, systematic thinking and I think at the right moment to drive real implementation plans for the various pieces. So thank you.
Exciting. It's been really fun.
It's great. So let's turn now to the budget and the budget planning and sort of talk just a little. You've got the memo. We got some great feedback. I know we've had lots of discussion with individuals. So presumably we'll have sort of a very brief presentation and then open it up.
Yep. And you'll notice that the PowerPoint actually literally just walks through the summary. So I will not spend much time on the PowerPoint as much as highlighting a few things and moving forward. I do want to highlight before we go into this, the specifics on next year's FY21 budget, follow up from our conversation around the rate increase and to let you guys know where we stand on implementing the rate increase that was passed last time, or the last board meeting. And so we have implemented that rate increase. There is the notification went out to the field, and we anticipate that all being implemented by the beginning of January, just given the rate. I'm looking back at Sean, right? That still works, right? Okay, we're still on track for the beginning of January. We were able to, should there be more action from the legislature on some of this, we were able to mitigate any impact to the field that allowed us to move forward with the board's decision from last time, but also ensure that should there be any more action on rates this year, we wouldn't require additional bureaucratic barriers for the field of having to implement that. And so I want to applaud the team that spent a lot of time identifying a way that with the rate certification form, which is the operationalization of a rate increase, that we were able to work language in that will allow that to be done once for any changes made this year. So thank you to the team who was able to do that. And in the meantime, we were able to go ahead and implement that. So I wanted to update on that part.
Thank you for the update and that work.
And so that does get annualized into the FY21 budget, and that's where we wanted to stay the starting point. So again, I will not belabor the fact that this is all built on the engagement that we've been having from the field, which is why we really spent time starting with what we've been hearing and then leading into this, and that this will continue to iterate throughout this process and continue to add more details. So we work to find themes, but without giving so much detail that we couldn't continue to be responsive to the field as we were getting that in. We also spent time this time, and particularly with the chair and secretary, of thinking through what was the most effective use of the board's voice and engagement on the budget. And I think as we looked at where we were in planning and what the budget process, how the budget process evolved over the last, or over the next 6 months, really felt that setting some priorities that allowed for the board to engage in ongoing dialogue throughout the budget process based on priorities that reflected the field and reflected the direction the board had been setting would be the most effective use of our time here today, particularly looking at this as the beginning of a multi-month engagement process on the budget. And so excited to go over some of these priorities with you today, but also wanted to highlight that there are multiple points and that we are looking at integrating not only our own information, but also the process that the budget goes through before it actually becomes real, before July FY20 or July 20. Okay, so you have an introduction that outlines our specific, the first page of the memo, and we were able to post that online and have the room has it too. And so I won't spend a lot of time reading it, but really looking at priority setting, the ability to evolve as strategic plan continues, and putting the board in a position to have and be part of an ongoing dialogue with stakeholders, both from the field but also the decision makers who are weighing in on the budget in a meaningful way. And again, thinking about the use of the board's time throughout the budget process effectively as being held to this meeting and moving forward. So we've broken down the budget priorities into 3 components, looking at our EEC systems and investments and being responsive to an evolving field, which includes the foundational data collection and tools for our financing mechanism. So really looking at that cost of quality and how we would look to operationalize that over the next few years. We do know this will be a multi-year process, that there is no way to innovate at this kind of scale without needing a multi-phase process, so that this, based on what I was hearing from the board and what I've been hearing from the field, this particular priority reflects an initial investment that would be put towards making some pretty innovative shifts in the way we do financing, incentivizing quality, but without knowing exactly what those mechanisms are, or what the levers might be, and our conversations would need to be with the feds, know that it would be a multi-year investment that would be needed. Again, parent fees, looking at that access point, I know that many of you are aware of and or engaged on, really thinking about resetting our parent fee structure and how we meet the federal goal and the access goal around making childcare more accessible for low-income families. Again, not knowing exactly what the financial impact of this is yet. We've really spent time knowing that this would be an initial investment, but that we need to do far more analysis before we know exactly what the financial cost would be, but this is an estimate. And then again, not really thinking about our regulatory change and our regulatory analysis that would help us look at our processes. So this would not be a financial impact necessarily this year, but is dependent on the staff capacity that is outlined in the next in the next section. I do want to highlight, though, for the regulatory changes, is that those would be necessary to implement anything around a financing mechanism change and or any we would need to look through that before doing anything like a rebid on our contracts to make sure we're rebidding based on an updated set of regulations. And so all of those are dependent, and why it's listed in here as a budget priority is making sure that that's done in a way that allows us to do all of the other changes with integrity. The second priority is about investing in EEC infrastructure. As I mentioned, there is a pretty much universal acknowledgement that we don't necessarily have the systems and structures in place, and mostly the staffing in place that would move forward. Could allow us to move forward to have the strategic impact we're looking to have in the field. And so you have here that this a substantial increase in staff salaries that we are working on. The exact staff positions will be defined by the guidehouse process, so we have some inclination about where those are going, but have been working closely with the Executive Office of Education and the Secretary to make sure that we're in sync on, as detail is evolving on the guidehouse process, we're feeding in, but also that we're not making uneducated decisions based on the fact that we're in the midst of this pretty deep process that's going to give us a lot better information. And then again, as Sheila pointed out, the technology necessary to think about how we best leverage not only our staff capacity, but also the field engagement on that, on the infrastructure there. And so what you see here at the $8 million is above and beyond the investment from this year, which was allocated to Executive Office of Education to implement our technology contracts. And I think that represents the acknowledgement from the field that we both have, that there needs to be some investment, some time into understanding where the technology intersects with the policies and process, and or the people and the processes, and that the comprehensive vision for technology needs to take into account the field engagement with it. And so we know there'll need to be some additional investment above and beyond what goes to EOE for our own planning and thoughtfulness on that as well. And then finally, these programmatic investments. So I think what you have here is I want to highlight something that it says in here, is that there is a significant amount of change and investment that has happened in new processes around a new QRIS outline, around professional development investments and workforce investments that happened in the last couple years. And so both what we've been hearing from the field and from working with the staff staff, is that establishing those, building coherence, and really spending some time now translating into the field will help us identify what gaps and what investments might need to be made in the future. But right now, stabilizing and sustaining those are more important than growing those while we build that bridge to the field that needs to utilize those. And so what we spent time with instead is identifying a couple places in the current investment where I think we need to look at, and this will be continued to outline as we get into deeper analysis around budget lines and goal setting. But there's a couple of places where the budget language is restrictive enough that we can't necessarily do the innovation the field is calling for. So that will be part of our programmatic conversations over the next a couple of months to be able to identify specifics on that. But I think even more of a highlight and a calling on this was that there are some areas where we don't know what investments needed because it's cross-collaboration with other agencies and our sister agencies, and that there's identified gaps that we don't necessarily know what the solutions are for, like the mental health conversation that we were defining. And so there's some more engagements, more conversations to understand what an investment would actually do to impact the problem, for example, that we were just identifying as part of the mental health supports available. And so while we don't have necessarily investments outlined, we do have areas where we know there are needed conversations in order to be able to be prepared for a future investment that would allow us to impact these metrics and outcomes. So I am going to stop there for now and answer any questions and address any concerns. The next thing I just wanted to highlight again in the PowerPoint on the timeline for some of these and where some of our next steps would be. But I think mostly wanted to answer questions and get engagement around the board budget priorities specifically.
Great, thank you. And folks on the phone, feel free to jump in. Let's open it up for discussion.
It's all you.
Having worked in a state system on education, I can't say how important it is to have the appropriate staffing in place. It's not just the money and it's not just the goal. We really have to have boots on the ground to be able to fulfill the mission and the work that needs to be accomplished. So I'm glad, once again, we're highlighting increased staffing. And I think it's critical to make sure it goes in the areas that we need to move the whole plan forward.
And I want to thank also the Executive Office of Education has been a key partner not only in helping really move Guidehouse work forward and making sure that's happening, but also in how we make budget recommendations around some of the key areas to build stability in the department. So I want to thank you for that comment, and also thank you to EOE for all of their support in that.
It's a huge undertaking, and I don't have my arms yet around, the details. Obviously, the planning is going to be ongoing in any event, but I really applaud the opportunity areas that you've identified and the goals. I just think they're spot on, and they really resound to me anyway, as if they're very valid issues that have developed from the listening tour and from talking to the field and the community. I also appreciate the logic of tying your budget to these and helping us understand that budget maybe and making it more real and more realistic, I think, in the long run. So thank you.
The commissioner already knows this, but I will just say one other thing. Obviously, I couldn't agree more. I think it's nice to have like 3 big buckets to really understand the lines and sort of help us make the hard decisions that you referenced earlier. There are going to be hard decisions. We're heading into an implementation phase. I think the design phase has more work than is probably feasible and realistic, and we're going to have to make some hard choices. I think the only other comment I'd make that the commissioner I've made before to her is that I would love for the third bucket, the programmatic investments and the increased coordination, to be where there might be some real incubator-like innovation work, which is to say, when we get into thinking about coordination with sister agencies, yes, no question, And I think there's a lot of room for growth always there, because these agencies become rightfully totally underwater trying to do their own work. And I think we want to keep pushing for the coordination. I also think it's where there is great latitude to try some new things, because it's a great space in which to think about how do we do the work differently, given that the needs are so similar, often the populations are the same. Yes, we want to do what we always do and we want to do it better, but I do think that this is the place for this agency to partner and try out some really unique kind of strategies as a state.
I think it is being demanded of us, because having spent last week with a bunch of other states spending time thinking about this, is that these are really complex issues that no one's really fully figured out.
Yeah.
And so there is an opportunity for Massachusetts to push the envelope, understand the innovation, understand about like how are we measuring impact and success of innovation, not that it's just been done, but that we've actually solved something, and that we have the scale, the size, and the capacity and the structure to do so. I mean, I spent a lot of time in California last week, kept being like, oh gosh, I'm so glad we're not you, because there's 6 million children in that education system, and so the scale of trying to innovate there and test is a very different conversation than we have, where we can look at how do we create innovation and test quickly, and I think is really a unique position we're in.
And remember that we generally are never that satisfied with our day-to-day interventions. I mean, they're not that effective. We are all trying our best, and it's certainly what we know works to a degree, but it's still not to the degree that we would all like, given the investments and the effort especially. So there's a way to think about it there too.
Yeah.
I think part of what's emerging as we think about our work within the broader context is, I think historically we've had a lot of mandates to work collaboratively with DCF and DTA, and I think we've gotten better and better at those over time. But I think now, as we look ahead, coordination with DESE becomes increasingly important, particularly as we think about the new policy context that's emerged with the Student Opportunity Act and the opportunity for districts to elect to use some of their education funding for things like pre-kindergarten and early education. And that's going to really necessitate much more formal collaboration between these agencies. We could start there, but I think ultimately it will touch all of the arenas that you've identified, Commissioner. And so that feels like a place where we have so much that we really can build upon, that we've learned so much about in terms of particularly the role of districts in supporting community-based providers and vice versa to jointly provide high-quality early childhood education. But those are places where I think innovation and scale are going to become increasingly critical, and where I think opportunity is really ripe.
Joan, I'd just like to add to that. I think about that on the local level, not just at
That's
the
right.
agency level.
That's
which
right.
Sometimes it's more challenging than very discrete activity on a local level.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, Sheila, that goes towards the role, I think, that hopefully is embedded throughout here, and also speaks to the Secretary's conversation or question around some of the community engagement and the role that the community is asking us to play, is how do we build opportunity for local innovation and parameters and invest in that, so that we can test, as Joan said, in the community engagement, it's the same question. Like, we have a bunch of infrastructure, but it's unique to us, but we still need state resources to bring down to be able to really leverage that. And I think they're asking the same thing on the K-12 early childhood side too. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Is this question the same thing of, we have resources, but how do we spend them effectively? And what supports can you provide? Sorry, I get water.
That we can get you. Thank you. Right. Anybody on the phone want to jump in? I just want to make sure there's room to get in if you're on the phone.
This is Mary. First of all, I really want to say just thank you. This has been a tremendous presentation with some really great thought, and I'm excited about the work. I also would just say ditto to Sheila's comments and yours, Noni, and certainly really agree with Joan as well. I will just add a little sort of odd tidbit that I also think that business and industry and the whole workforce field is awakening even more to the importance of our work.
That's a good point.
Both just in terms of what it means for kids and outcomes, but again, always the workforce support piece. And I think particularly in Massachusetts, with the Mass Competitive Partnership and some other pretty powerful business organizations that we have an opportunity to seize the moment as well and begin to really bring business probably more deeply into supporting our work. I think they're very much been in historically the K through 12 space, and that's been great. But I think there's a lot more work we can do here to get some powerful voices on behalf of young children. And so I'll just add that to the mix.
Yeah, and I think we haven't also, I agree with you, Mary, and I think we as a state need to keep pushing on, and I don't mean state at the agency level, Sheila, but just generally. I think public-private partnerships, certainly is an arena that we've got to keep pushing on and thinking through carefully.
It's interesting, there was more of that in the 80s than there is now.
Yeah.
I mean, I could tell you in Lawrence how factories,
Yep.
worked with several departments
Right.
to provide child care, and that's all kind of evaporated.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that is. I think, and it is a key dimension that I think the field and the business community is speaking up on, but also, again, needs our partnership in many ways, because in order to effectively think through how we need to respond to a changing definition of work, right? We have a gig economy now that doesn't follow the same kind of traditional paycheck styles that our systems are built on. We have businesses that are trying to step in and support employees through creative infrastructure that we can, I think, partner more effectively on. I think is really where we need to go, not only for the children that are in that care, but
Family.
the research is very clear that high-quality childcare makes better employees.
Right.
And so we have it all around.
And that's partly why this also ties to a conversation about the cost of quality.
Absolutely.
Right? That as we continue to think about the cost of quality, head towards tiered rates, where does the business strategy fit into this? How do we think about more partnerships that way?
Yep. And I wanted to just highlight also, I think the intention was, and we were able to send, again, put the budget memo online so that as you guys, to build some transparency into this process, to provide some dialogue with the field to be able to talk about the priorities. And while, it's been a race to catch up on everything, so maybe not as much time as I would have liked to get out, I do want to highlight that I have gotten a number of feedback from partners in the field that have thanked for the opportunity not only to say that, but also for the willingness to embed some of the innovation through this, of looking at financing structures and not just building more money, but really looking at this as an opportunity. And so I just wanted to highlight that I won't read the full quote and the full email, but I think that there's an appreciation of the board's willingness to think differently about some of these structures that are really hindering the implementation in the field.
Great. Other comments from folks? So I will say in closing, what's nice is this is not an in closing, which is to say we will continue to return to this. It will weave right through our retreat, where the strategic planning process leads us to some decisions that are also, sort of at least to some degree framed here in terms of categories, and we can just sort of start to work across those two matrices, if you will.
Yep. And I think to that point, Noni, that if you are Chair, if there are things in here that would be helpful to, the whole idea of the memo is that this can be a living document that you can use in conversations. And so if there are ways, iterations, or dimensions of this that would be helpful to have pulled out, or have the first sheet is intended to kind of serve as a summary. But, please don't hesitate to be in dialogue with the department of what you might need to be able to do that as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner. So if there are no other comments, then I will make the motion. Any other last comments?
Madam Chair, just in advance say that I'll be abstaining, because the way this process works is this board makes a recommendation to me, and then I forwarded it on to A&F and the governor. So I will stay out of it at this point, but I do want to appreciate the work that's gone into this, and in particular the format and the way in which we've tried to align strategy to spending.
Great. Excellent.
And
Carolyn.
just before you make the motion, just a clarification. So we're voting on budget priorities. We're not voting on any type of line item budget. Right?
That's right. The memo as its budget recommendation,
Okay, thank
which
you.
reflects the investment priorities. That's the motion. Thank you for clarifying. Everybody on the phone, I think it's Mary and Dave at this point.
Yes. Yes.
Great. Any last comments? Okay. I make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law C-15D4, hereby adopts the Department of Early Education and Care's proposed fiscal year 21 budget memo as its budget recommendation, which reflects the investment priorities for fiscal year 2021, in line with the feedback from the field and the department's ongoing strategic planning process. The board further authorizes the commissioner to submit the board's final budget recommendations to the Secretary of Education. Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Mary? Dave?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Abstentions? Right there. Opposed? Hopefully not. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for leading this, this process. It's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all.
We have one final agenda item, which has to do, speaking of cross-agency work, with a preschool development grant, Birth to 5, that is sits at EOE, and for which EEC's board in particular has a role to play. So look forward to kind of beginning this conversation. Undersecretary Reale is here, joined by a colleague from HHS, and look forward to this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and interesting to be on this side of the table. As many of you know, I've worked in Massachusetts state government for a long time. My name is Ann Reale. Welcome to our new board member. And I have a lot of history with system building as it relates to early childhood education, so I'm really thrilled to be able to share more about what we're doing in the latest stage of our system building efforts. And just wanted to spend a couple of minutes giving you maybe kind of a short history or brief history in system building across early childhood in Massachusetts. So when I first started in state government in a year that I will not mention, we were combining and looking at all the different childcare services and how they were offered across state government at the time. And it added up to, at the time, what was a pretty significant number. It was about $100 million, but it was budgeted across 4 different state agencies, managed in different ways, thought about in different ways, not looked at as, at the time, what would have been one of the largest agencies in state government. So we said if we look at that differently, we should recognize the scope of what we're doing in childcare and create the Office of Child Care Services. That happened around 1997, really dating myself now. I promise I won't go year by year. And then we evolved in a little bit more and said we've missed a big component from an educational perspective. There's a unit within our Department of Education at the time that thought about this in much more of an education way, and we need to connect and always think about it as education and care. And strategies for children, and a lot of advocates, and I'm sure many folks in this room and around this table were very successful in having a bill enacted to create the Department of Early Education and Care. And I worked in the governor's office with the commissioners at the time from Education and Public Health and OCCS to create the new agency, and then had the honor of serving as the first commissioner back in 2005. Left that position realizing that it's bigger than just one agency, and really appreciate hearing all the conversation today that validates that and builds on that and recognizes that EEC plays a really central role. But system building, as far as Massachusetts goes and any other state in the country goes, beyond any one agency. It's really thinking about how all of our efforts have an impact on young children and their families, especially vulnerable young children and hard-to-reach families. So after taking a turn through DC and thinking about that at the national level and looking at technical assistance to support the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, I once again came to the conclusion that it's bigger even at the federal level than any one agency, and came back to state government to work with Secretary Pizer and think about how the Executive Office of Education, which was just coming into being as I was leaving, could help serve in that convening role, not just across the agencies within the Executive Office of Education, which are EEC, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and the Department of Higher Ed, but to serve also as a nexus with other secretariats in state government, with Health and Human Services. And I want to share that unfortunately Undersecretary Katie Mick, who's a partner in the preschool development grant work, is only missing this meeting due to our snowstorm delay. And I'm really glad that Kate Roper is able to join us as a member of our operational steering committee. So as we were thinking about the preschool development grant and coming to that from a secretariat level standpoint, we realized that it was going to give us that opportunity to be the convener, to be the coordinator, to work with all of the agencies that are much more directly connected to the services and programs that are affecting young children and families. And we wanted that to be a focal point of the grant, that the way we came to the operation and the planning around the grant reflected what we want as a Commonwealth for how we come to much more complex issues of how to connect. And I'm building on the words of the EEC strategic plan, a frame that I really appreciate around people and process and technology in a way that spans more than just one agency, and really, to use a phrase that the Secretary often uses, adds up to more than the sum of the parts, as much as that's not my favorite phrase, mathematically and scientifically speaking. It does represent the idea that we can be transformative, that we can have those parts add up to more than just what they would if we kept them in their current form, and do more for the children that we all want to be able to have an impact on collectively than we would be able to do individually. So I want to just quickly go through the agenda and talk in a little bit more detail about the structure of the preschool development grant, about what we've been able to do to date, and about what we're hoping to do in the next iteration of the grant, the renewal grant. So I think we've got this. Early childhood system building, just want to spend a couple of slides going through kind of the background of system building, which again I know many of the members of the board are all too familiar with. A little bit of detail on the Massachusetts PDG B5 organizational structure, spend some time talking with you about the needs assessment findings initially that we've been able to develop with the help of our organizational structure and Accenture, the consulting firm that we engaged with to be able to do that work. Overview of what the initial grant and the renewal grant are going to help us accomplish. Talk about sustainability a little bit, and then next steps. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Kate Roper. And Kate, I know you've worked in the field for many years. I will not say the number. And at DPH for 13. And I've had the pleasure of working with you on many system building activities, a lot of which are represented in this next slide. So thanks so much for being here.
So my official title is I am the, sorry, I have that thing that's going around. I am the Director of Early Childhood Services at the Department of Public Health's Bureau of Family Health and Nutrition. And one of my hats that I wear is that I am the Principal Investigator for a systems building grant called the Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems Grant, or we call it Massachusetts Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems, or MECS for short. That's really is why I came to state government 13 years ago. It brings together health, mental health, family support, parent education, and early education and care, and has become more specifically focused on developmental health of young and relational health of young children birth to 3, including doing some work with 2 place-based communities in Springfield and Chelsea. This early childhood systems building slide has been my life for the past 13 years. The first, Ian calls the top 2 the ovals, and the first oval on the left was this magical moment in time where multiple federal agencies came together and decided to try to coordinate across silos. I like the de-siloing, and turned the silos on their sides and brought them together and made them into a Venn diagram, and listed out some ways that those could come together operationally. For a brief moment in time, it felt like maybe they would actually really align the funding streams and eligibilities and all kinds of things. And they did a little bit, and then administrations changed. To the right is a version of that developed by the BUILD initiative, which sort of took the health, mental health, early learning, family support, and really called out special needs and early intervention. And BUILD initiative is funded by private foundation and is in multiple states, unfortunately not in Massachusetts. So those are just some historical things. In the pie chart on the bottom left is something that was developed by the Birth to Grade 3 task force that was a cross-agency group that put together this frame for looking at how we could have a common agenda to bring the field together, including aligning standards, building a robust assessment system, and enhancing educator effectiveness, increasing community engagement, and providing comprehensive services. And then on our right is sort of the latest latest and greatest. The Pritzker Foundation has developed a national collaborative for infants and toddlers, which really kind of shifts the focus on birth to 3, because, you know, with the focus on universal pre-K, birth to age 3 was somewhat neglected and left a little on the wayside. So this really strengthens the focus on health, and including prenatal, really looks at universal family connection, including home visiting, and then also affordable care options that work for the infants and toddlers and their families. And really looks to have system outcomes, and the ultimate outcomes is that children thrive. And just to note that the commissioner referenced the strategies for children, mass partnerships for infant toddler professionals, and that came out of an initial application to the Pritzker Foundation that was unsuccessful, and then a wonderful early childhood funders collaborative in Massachusetts that I believe Mary was a part of, stepped up to fund them to do some work and support, and particularly around the preschool development grant stakeholder engagement. So we do this. Just as a quote from the PDG, that it's really designed to support states to coordinate and align early childhood care and education. And I want to be clear that in their definition, it goes beyond what we think of as the mixed delivery system to include early intervention, home visiting, and family support, such as the CFCE programs and other programs in the state. To take the programs that already exist and improve their quality, facilitating better partnerships, improving transitions from these programs into elementary school, increasing and operating cost efficiencies, and expanding parental choice and involvement, and ensuring families are linked to the full range of services that they need. And we borrowed this lovely diagram from 0 to 3 that sort of takes some of what we just had in the previous slide and puts together kind of the similar puzzle pieces. And we've really organized our work around these themes. So one of the things we wanted to talk a little bit about is how the work that we've been doing with the PDG Birth to 5 maps onto initiatives that we've been doing in the state over the last several years. We decided not to go back decades, even though we could, because of time considerations. But faces around the table and behind me in the room have been parts of all of these many interagency collaborative efforts. So just to start on the top right, Desi's been really working hard on the Family Engagement Framework Coalition that brings together 11 state agencies and regional coalitions of, I think I just recently heard, 500 people coming together to really look at how various systems define family engagement, trying to bring that together into one common framework, including what best practices are, and get buy-in from the various agencies and stakeholders to improve how we connect with families. And certainly with the PDG, Donna Trainham sits on one of our work groups, and many of the members on the PDG are part of the engagement collaborative. So this is a really kind of critical piece of the work. And I think a lot of our coming together around family engagement comes from a previous effort around strengthening families, which has become a key piece of EEC's operations, as well as the Children's Trust, also DCF, and some within DPH. So again, we have that history, and we've continued to build on it. Joni.
Add to that, actually have the honor of reviewing the framework, and it's really nice to have seen and participated in the hundreds of folks across the systems, DESE, EEC, Higher Ed, DPH, that have really, really impacted the development of that.
It's really powerful.
And I look forward to EEC, as you would say, putting teeth in it and seeing how we can integrate that across our initiatives.
Exactly. Thank you. So going down to the right, just to pick out a few things. One of the things I'm talking about, implementation science, the pyramid model state leadership team. Under that work, EEC and DESE have done an amazing job in rolling out the pyramid to now 100 implementation sites across the state, going deep rather than broad and shallow. And it's been a really powerful model of how you implement professional development, including with a leadership team at each site, coaching, and really effective training. Also, under Race to the Top, one of the things that was funded were interagency service agreements with multiple state agencies to support professional development around issues like child development, developmental screening, trauma-informed two-generation work. And so, again, we have those models from the past that we could bring forth in the future. In terms of looking at data sharing, evaluation, and coordinated systems, one of the things that there was a National Governors Association cross-systems group that developed a Building the Foundations for Birth to Third Grade that really looked at the core competencies that tied to career success later on, and that led to the Birth to Grade 3 advisory. In terms of community-level collaborations, which is really where the rubber hits the road, we have the PEG and the CPPI, but we also have multiple ones across home visiting. Our Massachusetts Early Childhood Comprehensive System, again, the MEX grant, has teams doing collective impact work in Springfield and Chelsea. In terms of messaging, and coordinating communication with the field, EEC and multiple agencies. I was on the task force for this, as many other people in this room probably were, on developing the Brain Building in Progress campaign on the website, also partnering with United Way on that. And then the Children's Trust has One Tough Job, which really focuses kind of on, engaging families. And then in terms of screening, early identification, and assessment, the early literacy expert panel had worked for a long time in terms of looking at what are the opportunities and challenges within that arena, and coming up with recommendations around for birth to 5 to use the Ages and Stages questionnaire, 3 and social emotional, as recommend those to be commonly used across systems, partly because they already were being commonly used across systems, and partly because they were very family-friendly and family-driven tools. And then we were also very much influenced by the United Way's Drive initiative that did a lot of innovation, both around how to encourage families to participate in screening who weren't involved in formal care through use of a parent screen or a parent trained to screen, help with the screening process, and then also help link the family to follow up if there was a concern identified, as well as to create, to purchase the online license so that all the data could be aggregated together and make that data actionable for the programs and for United Way overall. So one of the things that they learned was that across the multiple sites, which were early education and care and CFCE and other sites in the Boston area, that fine motor skills was the area with the greatest concern. And so they were able to use that information to create curricula to share across those programs. And in the later screenings, they noticed there was improvement in that area. So again, part of the goal with all of that is to make the data actionable, because as we know, a lot of our programs collect data and then they don't know what to do with it. I think it's you, Anne.
So turning from that to the specifics of how we've organized around the Preschool Development Grant Birth to 5 project, we've got 6 different agencies working together really differently and collaboratively in service to the goals of the grant, and picking up on the theme, which I really appreciated, the pairing of these 2 presentations today, but the EEC's family and stakeholder engagement theme of needing better coordination and wanting to work with sister agencies in a different way. EOE and HHS are at the secretariat level responsible from an infrastructure standpoint for technology and IT in service to the agencies, so it makes sense and offers a great nexus there, again, from that technology standpoint, to think about our engagement, but also as coordinators and conveners of the agencies within each of those secretariats to think about how we could work together differently. I know all of you are very familiar with the Department of Early Education and Care and all the programs listed under there. Kate is representing the Department of Public Health and is most familiar with EI, but we also have home visiting and WIC as a key set of the programs that we're looking at. And for DESE, again, from a birth to 5 perspective, the preschool and special education programs, but also the opportunity to look longitudinally and connect data to later success in other grades and understanding how or if what we do in the younger years has an impact on third grade MCAS and later school success and even post-secondary success. And last but not least, Children's Trust is a organization that also sits under the Executive Office of Education, also runs home visiting programs in partnership with the Department of Public Health, and has family resource centers, which in many cases house coordinated family and community engagement networks and connects with families in a broader way to support child development, and has parent education and support programs to benefit them as well. But mostly on this slide, I want to focus on the right-hand side, which is where the board has a really important role to play as it relates to preschool development grant work, and most importantly, I think, to sustaining the network and the collaboration that we've developed with other agencies to provide guidance and strategic direction through board and subcommittee meetings to foster those feedback loops, which the commissioner's already spoken to, and have to be strengthened and extended to include the sister agencies, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And really through that to ensure that our work reflects the expressed needs of providers and families and stakeholders and builds on existing efforts, which is a key component. If you had noticed a few slides back, that the PDG grant and the federal government, and it's a joint effort across the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services and Education, really do stress that states are expected to build on existing efforts. So they set that as an expectation in the grant. And they set that as an expectation in that every state is required to have a state advisory council. The Board of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts serves double duty. And there's an expectation that you need and should and will be deeply involved in the implementation of the strategic plan so that we can have that collective impact, have the greatest likelihood of changing outcomes for children birth to 5 in Massachusetts. So just want to pause there for a second and just pause, move on to the next detail and then Noni, go
Can I
ahead.
just ask a clarifying question on this previous slide, Anne? Thank you for coming. This is there's the 1.8 initial grant, which has been held for couple years.
Yeah.
And there's a pending renewal.
Right.
How do we understand this? This was the work of the initial grant?
So this is the organizing frame for the preschool development grant birth to 5 for both the initial grant and the renewal grant. And
I see.
And the organizing structure on the next slide is what will continue through the renewal grant and what we included in the renewal grant.
Okay.
Makes
Thank you.
sense? Okay. So just to go into a little bit more detail, there's the organizing structure that we established for the initial grant, which again is what we had proposed in the renewal grant, to have an executive steering committee that's representative of the leaders of the 6 agencies involved in the work, co-chaired by Secretary Pizer and Secretary Sutters, representative of all the commissioners and the executive director of the Children's Trust, also with the governor's office representative, and inclusive of the operational steering committee members, which are the folks in that green box, several of whom are here today. Kate Roper, who's joining me for the presentation, Katie Mick and I co-chair that group. Jocelyn and Carol and Chris Pond from EEC have been terrific partners. Catherine McCourt from the Executive Office of Education has been instrumental in just about every aspect of the preschool development grant, and really want to thank her for all her work. Sarita Rogers from the Children's Trust, Lauren Viviani from DESE, and Eve Wilder from DPH. So we've been meeting every other week for the better part of 2019 to try to create coordination and collaborative opportunities among and between us as an agency. In some ways, I think of that as our internal stakeholder engagement, because you need to build those relationships among and between agency staff who have worked together in some cases for years, but never had the opportunity to work together on the same thing. And on the same programs that we run on the day-to-day basis. Typically, it's on programs that are funded by a philanthropic initiative or a federal grant, and they begin and they end, and we move on to the next thing. And the goal is to build and strengthen and deepen those relationships through the PDG grant by having them meet and actually run the work stream teams. So the members of our operational steering committee meeting each head up a work stream team that fits to their particular area of expertise. And the parent knowledge and choice team is where we're really thinking deeply about family engagement across all the agencies. The referral tracking system is connecting existing referral tracking that happens through home visiting programs. data system I'll get into in a little bit more detail in a little bit, but it gets the executive offices working together with agencies to connect data for the first time. And then finally and importantly, the provider training and best practices. So all of those work stream teams include even more staff from agencies who have that expertise in those areas and are represented by the leaders of those teams on the OSC, who are also accountable to the ESC. And on the right-hand side, we have to deepen the engagement with you and with other stakeholder groups. There are also the boards of elementary and secondary education and the Board of Children's Trust, which have a vested interest in this work, and over 20 standing meetings across the participating agencies of different stakeholder groups who also share in furthering outcomes for children birth to 5. So on the next slide, I'm just going to turn it over to Kate because it goes into a little bit more detail, to your point of how the two grants overlap and connect to each other, and then we'll go from there. Thanks, Kate.
So our vision is that we provide families of children birth to 5 equitable access to a coordinated and robust network of quality programs and supports that enable the development of their children into lifelong learners and contributing members of their communities. And our goal is to increase the number of children entering kindergarten with the competencies to succeed academically and socially, emotionally. And so to speak to your question, Noni, the grant was initially received in the end of December 2019, and I believe the funding didn't actually arrive until April or May, so that was an interesting challenge.
We didn't let that stop us, though.
No,
We kept talking.
But that's one reason why we've applied and secured a no-cost extension through, I believe, September 2020. And then the renewal grant was submitted a few weeks ago, and hopefully we'll hear around the same time. And it's a competitive grant, so we will know then whether we were successful. It would be a 3-year grant.
So Kate, I think you were also going to cover some of the initial findings, and I mentioned, I think, that we were working with Accenture, who helped us develop some of these initial facts and findings, and there's a connection to a deeper level of data analytics that part of our grant is going to help us achieve. So these are just collected from existing data, census data, and existing information. Thanks.
So, it reiterates a lot of the points that the commissioner made. The decrease, the 4.6% decrease in children birth to 5, the slight increase in proportion of low-income children, the very significant increase of low-income children in the Latinx community, also increase of children who are foreign-born and children with disabilities. We see the decrease in rural and the increase in urban populations, and that 50% of our low-income kids are in just 14 cities, 10 of which are gateway cities. And also a point that economically disadvantaged pre-K to 3-year-old children are chronically absent. We're missing part of the, are 18% chronically absent versus 10% of the children at large. So again, one of the points that this really struck us with is that the populations that are growing are also the populations who are already not having great outcomes around attendance and also the MCAS, because there's a lot of parallels in that. So, it behooves us to really think about our systems and how we respond to the needs of those children and families who may be not being as engaged in our system. We were pulling some data for our commissioner on enrollment in preschool, and one of the things that Child Trends data pointed out is that with the Latinx community, while there's been an increase in the number of Latinx kids in preschool, the gap has remained constant, and it's something like a 10% gap between children at large. So, thinking about how do we address the needs, our commissioner often talks about precision public health. And so how do we think about operating on, as the commissioner said, a more granular level to respond to the needs of children and families?
Thanks, Kate. And I'm not going to go through this whole slide. I don't know how you guys do it for 3 hours. Actually, I do know because we did it for a long time. It's a lot. But just at the top level for this slide, I do want to just think through the initial grant had 4 frames around the state and local agency level. The coordination and the planning, and especially the data system, is where we're focusing our initial efforts. We have not yet reached out to local agencies. That's a big focus of the next phase of stakeholder engagement in coordination with Massachusetts Partnership for Infants and Toddlers and our renewal grant. But the strengthening of the alignment among and between our state programs, and especially as it relates to connecting data across our state programs and knowing more about what our agencies are currently doing is key at that focus area. And then on the family front, I think there's just so much connection, again, with the EEC strategic planning that we really want to understand and be able to connect not just what we already know about families through the EEC waitlist and through the work that we're learning from other agencies that Kate just spoke to from a public health perspective, but also understanding, are there expectations and needs being met in the context of the changing demographics? So if a family isn't able to access a child care program that operates 10 hours a day, Monday through Friday, what are their options? Is that playing into why we don't see more children on the waiting list that don't reflect the full population of low-income children in Massachusetts, especially for infants and toddlers and families with very young children who are hard to reach, who are coming from communities where they aren't able to access that type of licensed, regulated setting? How can we understand more about what those needs are and do it in languages and through trusted advisors and communities and neighbors and friends and churches in a way that really recognizes their voice and engages them in the process? And how can we first start doing that by speaking with one voice as agencies and understanding and doing outreach in a way that respects their needs and their preferred ways of communicating what's important to them and to their children. And speaking of children, connecting the existing systems that we have for understanding more about child development is a focal point of the grant, not because we think developmental screening is the end-all and be-all of an early childhood comprehensive system, but we know that it's an essential element. And if we could do that more reliably across all the agencies that are already doing that, it gives us a more consistent point of engagement with families, especially for ASQ, which is a family engagement tool first and foremost. And it gives our agencies a way of understanding how we're working with them as a commonwealth that connects across more than just the program that a particular agency is funding. And providers sit importantly at the center of all of that work, because for the most part, our state agencies aren't working directly with families and children. They're working through a provider or a community or an organization that is working with that child and family and relying on the state to provide the guidance and the funding to do that effectively. So on the next slide, it's a deeper dive into what those focal
Excuse me, Ann, can I
points
ask a
look
question?
like. Sure, Carolyn, yeah.
So with regard to sort of the family engagement and sort of helping families to understand developmental delays and DPH obviously being a partner, I'm wondering what the connection is with like the Mass Act Early campaign, the Ages and Stages materials, the new videos that have been developed regarding identifying developmental delays.
That's a great question, and it's actually a great segue to this slide too, and I'll skip down to that point and skip back up to the others. So if we go down to on the initial grant side, second from the bottom, it's connect existing family resources and outreach. We're focusing that on child development and understanding, helping families and helping the individuals and providers that are working with them recognize through ASQ if there does seem to be a developmental delay, not using that as confirmation of that, recognizing that it just indicates the need for further assessment and referrals. And how do we track that is the question. And right now we don't. We track it individually. If you're in an individual program, going back to the slide of all the different agencies that are involved, each program may track it, but there's no way to connect that information among and between programs. And we want to understand that not just from the standpoint of a developmental screener, but also for information that's going out to families like the CDC work and Act Early, like what's happening through Children's Trust, like what DESE has through the Family Engagement Network, like what EEC has through Brain Building in Progress. Are we sharing similar information in a way that the families we want to reach most are able to understand and act on? And are we doing that through the trusted advisors indicators that the commissioner spoke about, not just hoping that they'll click into a website.
And how are we actually making sure that the people they're more likely to interact with actually know the same information? Like I know
Yeah,
that
absolutely,
the Mass Act Early campaign, you know, it has information for families, but then it also has a lot of really good information for pediatricians.
It does.
And so, I mean, really, when your child's very young, that's usually
That's
the
right.
person that you do interact with and look for guidance. And, you know, as the parent of a child with disabilities, I can say that, you know, it's like, oh, we'll wait and see, or, you know, maybe everything's fine. And you're really looking to your pediatrician for that guidance. And I think that, quite honestly, they could use a lot more information and training themselves. And I think that the tools are on that website are incredibly helpful in including the fact that they're interpreted in multiple languages. I just don't know how well we actually promote those resources. That was my concern.
Yeah, and that's your. I didn't plant you. Absolutely. We are, Eve Wilder, who is the leader of the Parent Knowledge and Choice, has been very active in working with Elaine Gavich, her name just went shoo, who helped develop those videos. And if people aren't aware of them, we can make them available. But what they did is they created videos that had a parent, a pediatrician, and kind of a community person in 8 different languages, so 8 different parents, 8 different pediatricians, to really talk about developmental issues and what it would mean if your child had one, and then what would be the next steps in the sequence. Because I think, you know, part of what we know is that we have this huge myriad of websites and various things, and I was poking through them the other day, and it really struck me that you kind of already had to know where you wanted to be before you found that website. And if you were a parent, like I had a family member recently who was like, concerned about her grandson, and she didn't know where to start. And I gave her an ASQ, and she was so grateful. And and then I was able to refer her to early intervention. And of course, her son was like 2.5, so he got a minute of early intervention. And that's what we don't want to have. We have the most robust early intervention system in the country. We have the most flexible eligibility. We serve 3 times the national average of kids in our early intervention system. And any child who is referred can get a full assessment. So the screening is really meant to get you to that full assessment. The getting families, what about the families who don't get there or who don't follow up on their concerns? In addition to the lack of availability are fear of immigration, the community norms being they'll grow out of it, or other cultural norms or feelings that the services aren't going to be cultural sensitive.
Well, one of the things I think is incredible about those videos is they're done in different languages to address specific types of cultural barriers that may impact the parents, but also the extended family's view of what's going on, because we all know that, everybody has an opinion on what's going on with the child, but then there are certain cultural issues that impact how information is being interpreted, and it's really to sort of assist families with sort of saying, no, actually, maybe something is going on, and I need to request further testing. I just thought that there was, as helpful as the information is for families on that website, I actually took the time to read the pediatrician information, and I was like, wow, if this could be just disseminated more broadly into pediatricians' office, because while they want to help, a lot of times recognizing delays are not something that they're necessarily experts at, or it's more the wait and see approach. And as we know, the earlier point in time that we get intervention is the most effective.
Sure, I don't know. Sheila?
Yeah, is this grant 8.3 million a year? That's a significant grant.
It is.
I just wonder how this strategic plan relates to the one we just discussed, and where the integration is, and it just seems like it's coming at the perfect time. Are we working together?
We absolutely are. No, not at all. And it'll be complementary, and I want to be complimentary to the commissioner for her willingness and ability and perfect timing and trying to connect the deep work that needs to happen at EEC, specific DEC programs, with the broader work that we're trying to do in the PDG frame, and knowing that those are absolutely connecting. And we are putting together our strategic plan as we speak, and again, it spans probably a broader scope. It definitely does, across what the programs that are in scope for PDG cover. And I know through
It would
the,
be such a wonderful example of
Absolutely.
alignment that we're trying to
That's
do, right?
yes, exactly.
Well, and it seems to me like the opportunity we don't want to miss is that this grant is designed for the cross agency. So I want, like, when I read this list of activity, the thing I'm not totally clear on is where's the, like, I would still want to know what's the value add given that it's a state level grant and that lots of this activity actually would just double down on things that are happening. So how do you think about, like, the specific value add of this at the cross agency? Am I missing?
Yeah, so let me just go through each one, and maybe I can speak to exactly that cross-agency value as it relates to each one. So for the initial needs assessment, we're thinking about that in a cross-agency way, right? We want to understand not just who's eligible for childcare, but to Kate's point, who's eligible for EI? Do the patterns in EI have any relationship at all to what's happening in childcare or in preschool special education in the public sector? Does home visiting have any relationship with that? Is connection to a CFCE program or a family resource center an indicator? To look at that scope.
This is in your needs assessment?
In the renewal grant aspect of the needs assessment.
Okay.
So as we get down to a deeper level and a deeper dive on data, it'll be important to understand those relationships among and between the agencies. From an EEC perspective, Commissioner, I think there's a significant challenge even understanding that at a level of depth for the programs that EEC operates, right? So there's a connection there even within each of the agencies to understand more about what their own data is telling them from an agency perspective. That's important just to the agency. From an outcomes perspective across all of what we want for children birth to 5, we need to think about that more holistically across and among and between all the agencies that might be working with that family and those children. So that needs assessment and the strategic plan are going to take on that really big challenge of thinking about it in a much broader perspective across the agencies that are working through the operational steering committee and the executive steering committee. And asking the agencies to do that deeper dive at an agency-specific level to know how their existing programs may or may not have an impact on the work that we're doing at the state level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So the data system is the underpinning to that. So right now we have tremendous amounts of individual agency-specific, child-specific data that I think in some cases agencies aren't able to use as well as they'd like to, and we at the state level don't have any access to at all. So for the first time, we are able to put everybody in a room who's got access to these individual data sets, and they own that data, and they will always own that data, and this is always going to have to be done with the most stringent attention to privacy and security standards. But we have an opportunity to securely and safely and appropriately connect that information, and it's an expectation of the federal grant that we unduplicate it and get an aggregate look, making sure that we can't re-identify any child out of that data set, but get an aggregate look at how many children are participating in which programs, if we have that child level data. How often did they participate, for how long? Did they participate in more than one program? Did they participate in nothing? And how did we look at that longitudinal information in a way that impacts our day-to-day program and budget? We haven't had that opportunity to date. Through this grant, we are putting those folks in a room, lawyers included.
And me.
And Kate.
When you were talking about experts, I'm like, how did I get on the lawyer one?
We hope to have that data use license agreement, which is the legal authority we need to be able to connect those data sets within the next couple of months. And then actually need to pull that data into one place and start analyzing it with the agencies at the table and sharing that information once the agencies are in agreement about how it looks and if it's reflective of the data that they're most familiar with. Most especially at the agency level and to the executive steering committee, but over time through the renewal grant, if you look to the right side of this, sharing it down to the local level, because in many cases, the local level wouldn't have any better information than we do, or more reliable information. They have it anecdotally. They certainly know it to the child, and programs certainly know the kids that they're working with, but there's no way to look at that reliably at a community and a local level and make good decisions at the community and local level about how to target resources, especially for hard-to-reach families. So if we could take that state information and and package it for a local city or town to know how many of their children are enrolled in a EEC subsidized childcare program, how many of them are enrolled in the public school, how many of them had a home visiting opportunity, how many of them have been referred to EI, then they can act on that locally and customize their programs and their activities appropriate to what the data is telling them. I know data-driven decisions made the list of frequency of the survey respondents. I was happy to see that it was dead last on the list, but it made the list. And it is a really pivotal part of what we have to start thinking about to use this information.
So I find all of this interesting because I think, as you know, these are questions we've been asking
Right.
for 30 or 40 years, even older than me. And I think to follow up on what Noni and Sheila had said in terms of how does this align with what EEC is doing and is planning to do, I think we also, it would behoove us to look at what you're proposing here and see how can we build on existing infrastructures.
Yep.
So this last example that you just gave, the community coalition planning and implementation grants, we do have about close to 30 needs assessments
Yeah.
that address those questions.
That's awesome.
You just
Yeah,
said.
yeah.
And it might help inform how we want to do that. We also have, I don't know, 86 community early childhood councils that cut across every single community.
Yeah.
And so again, we want to look at how are those working and what else can we add to it so it's a value add
Yeah.
and not another piece.
I totally agree, Joni. I couldn't agree more. I really want to stress that the way that we articulated the community coalition planning and implementation grants was to build on what's already out there and not recreate that. In some cases, we might want to make sure that different organizational structures are connecting to each other, so not to have one meeting over here and another meeting over there, or adding members if they're not representative of the agencies that we've got. Yeah.
For example, I'm one of two I'm in one of two communities
Yeah.
that have a pyramid model
Right.
community leadership.
Yeah.
There's also the CFCE councils. There's
Yeah.
also what was PEG needs assessment groups that got together. So
Yep.
there are
Lots of great,
fluid groups
absolutely.
in the community.
Yeah. And it would be, I think, for the first time, giving them a common set of data and information to organize that work around, but absolutely building on that work, not duplicating
And
it.
they might be able to inform a
Yes,
lot of things.
yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Thank you.
And we want to also be certain of two things, that infants and toddlers are highly representative across the various systems, which we know that they often are, but sometimes when the focus has been more on the UPK side, that's not always been who's highly at the table.
But I think the existing community groups that I just talked about
Mhm.
are really birth through 5, if not
Yeah.
birth through
Yeah.
grade 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to really include parents and community members.
That is,
Yeah.
absolutely foundation.
Yeah. So just moving through the other grant activities, the online license to connect existing ASQ usage on the initial grant. As I mentioned before, and through the early literacy expert panel, Noni, we know that there are existing state expectations for programs to use the Ages and Stages questionnaire, both ASQ3 and ASQ SE, which is more about social emotional development. And Kate is much more well-versed in this. I am not. I just know about it from more of an operational, organizational standpoint, that if we have all of our home visiting programs using ASQ, the MEX grant that Kate's been involved with, early intervention uses it, Project Launch uses it, the Parent-Child Home program uses it, the community coordinated family community engagement programs use it, and it's required at level 2 for the QRAS. How can we think about that and support that in a much more comprehensive, organized way from the state level? And we thought that through the PDG grant, one of the first ways of doing that would be to buy a single online license, which is not currently being used. Every program buys ASQ and delivers ASQ in whatever way they feel is appropriate or affordable to them to meet the requirement. And we are taking on what sounds like a simple thing, but is actually a really complex change management effort to say that we should have one online license that would allow multiple providers to connect the ASQ screening and development work up through the state and be able to look at that and share results across and among and between programs. Definitely for the same kids appropriately, and again, with all the privacy and consent concerns addressed. And then in an aggregate level, it allows us to collect that information and look at it across and among and between state programs. Building on that, we know it's not just enough. Yeah.
Favor, please? And I always say this when
Yeah.
we talk about ASQ.
Yep.
If we're going to emphasize ASQ, which I think for me is a very good tool to help families
Yes.
get information. But if you're also linking it to identification of developmental disabilities or the potential for special needs,
Right.
which I hear a lot, let us also collaborate with our SPED colleagues.
Yeah.
Because families are going to hear two different bits of information.
And that's an awesome segue, Joni, to that next bullet point. So the scope of work to align existing referral systems is part and parcel to this. ASQ is just one first small step in the right direction. Without a referral or without the sharing of information about that to the appropriate folks who would actually be able to act and understand if there is a developmental delay that needs further attention, it doesn't really add up to as much as it could. So we have referral systems right now that support our home visiting programs. They're not connected. They're also not connected to a referral system that the United Way has established through the DRIVE initiative. And the scope of work that we're trying to finalize through the initial grant would at least have us understanding what it would take to connect the existing systems, which would put us in a better place through the renewal grant to think about, again, how safely and appropriately and with all the right provisions, Joni, that you just talked about, we could expand that to share those referrals and make sure that all the right folks working with those children have access to the right information appropriately to make sure that they get the services that they need. So then I talked a little bit about connecting existing family resources and outreach. The renewal grant would help us not just do that in a web-based way and building on the resources you talked about, Carolyn, but implement new techniques and resources for family engagement. Most importantly, and I really want to stress this, in coordination with an expectation that the community coalitions, which would be established first in all of our gateway cities and in rural communities that have high proportions of low-income children, that those community coalitions are skilled and well-versed in how to use those family engagement techniques and building their plans, which we would require of them through the renewal grant, around what they know about the families in their communities. And then the last piece of this is the provider piece and the necessity of understanding how this relates to how anyone working with a young child, whether that's a home visitor or an early educator or a public school teacher or someone in one of our family resource centers or CFCE programs, knows how to effectively use developmental screening. Ideally, that would be ASQ, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's the narrow focus of this grant just because we don't want and are very cautious not to duplicate other terrific professional development efforts that are happening. And we did want to find a thread that allowed us to connect all of these different programs for young children, not necessarily just through licensed early education and care programs, but is there a common denominator that facilitates family engagement and helps the folks that are working with young children be able to reliably work with those families, especially if that child is exhibiting a developmental delay or the potential for one. And then connecting that work up through the use of data, the appropriate interaction with a family to discuss those kinds of findings and referrals for services as needed. And the renewal grant would allow us to build on that and actually deliver that training, so the initial grant doesn't actually get that training delivered. The initial grant just helps us to develop it. The renewal grant would help us actually deliver that training, and importantly, partnering with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education would also include WIDA, which I am not familiar with, I apologize, but Noni's nodding, to the early years. So we have it for K through 12 education. This would allow us to pilot WIDA for students and children, young children who are not in families that speak English as a first language, to understand more about how to implement that and work with DESE to do that.
And the EEC has guidelines and a framework for dual language learners that
Yep.
WIDA develops
Awesome.
in collaboration with the department.
Perfect, Joni. Yeah, it would give us a chance to build on that as well.
Can I just, I know you're going to wrap up, and this is obviously the beginning of a conversation, but, you know, one thing that I'm struck by, and I'm not speaking for the board, but just myself, is this is a lot of activity, right? And there's $8 million a year in this renewal. This activity against the goal, there's a really distal, like more at the kid level, more kids ready for kindergarten. That's a really, kind of aspirational goal and a very good one. The question that I would have is, if you think about the strategy with the dollars, this is presumably not coverage statewide on any one of these things, right? And so in some respects, you could imagine also, like, another way to think about this is to take the 8.3 each year and do a couple of these things at scale, right? Like, presumably there's a lot of decisions here about scoping. Do you see what I mean? Or I guess I have a question.
So the scale, the biggest piece of the scale is with the Community Coalition planning and implementation, and that would take the most significant dollars if we were to go beyond planning grants and implementation grants and do more service delivery. And that's where I think the real connection would be to the EEC strategic plan, and understand how, if we are thinking that the planning and implementation grants, for instance, are yielding great opportunities for collaboration at a local level, how do we support that through grants that are already coming through EEC? Or how do we support that through a different approach to early intervention? Or
presumably service delivery is the least strategic at the state level, given the goals of the overall grant program, right? That in some ways, the grant is about alignment and cross-agency kind of work.
Yes.
So presumably, like, landing at the end of the day on more service delivery wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, not just more, but better. I think that's the key, right? We could always do the math on more.
Okay, so let's say better, but it's still going to be a small percent of the population, right?
I think that's the key of the data strategy, is understanding what percentage of the population we're even serving now, and understanding that more reliably, and knowing where and how, based on the community coalition work, it's appropriate and necessary in that community to think about, for that community, what's the best way to reach children birth to 5 and make sure that they're in a good place to start school ready to learn. And to the Secretary's very important point, once they get to that school, the school is ready for them and can keep them on track through 3rd grade MCAS. But that's the local level conversation that really is integral to this whole thing.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Sure. So building on that maybe is this question about sustainability, Noni, I think, because inherent in what you just shared is what happens next. I mean, if we're spending all these dollars, how do we make sure at the end of the grant it was worth it? And that it really strengthened our infrastructure and our assessment and professional development and family engagement and data systems in a way that will last beyond the end of the grant. And the key, I think, from our planning structure is to now, as we're moving into implementation, continue to think about all of us as responsible for this work, but necessarily and legally having to ask a single agency to be accountable for managing a grant, or for executing a contract, or for taking the data analytics in and sharing it back out to agencies, and making sure that we're keeping an eye on how to do that in line with the data use license agreement. So in phase 2, the renewal grant's going to call those questions even more specifically, and we'll have to make some really good decisions at the executive steering committee level and with the board to know how to task agencies and ask agencies to take responsibility for individual aspects of the grant, while continuing to work collaboratively across the secretariats and agencies who have that shared responsibility. And in some really specific cases, sustainability is going to be a necessity. If we have a single license for ASQ online, every agency is going to have to find a way to work together to make sure that that license is expanded and renewed in a way that works for all of the agencies. We wouldn't just stop using it. We'd be talking to each other in a really different way about how we're using it. For the data analytics, we'd be maintaining that data set and improving it and building on it in real time and extending it on a regular basis to make sure that it's continuing to inform all of the agencies' work. That's not just one agency's responsibility. It's everybody's. So the sustainability is inherent in the activities of the grant, at least for some. For others, it may be a little more fragile in terms of whether or not an agency wants to continue a specific activity. Kate, I don't know if you want to just wrap up with the next steps.
Sure. So next steps. As we have talked about, the Mass Partnership for Infants and Toddlers are doing survey and focus groups and forums, including kind of rethinking focus groups to more like parent cafes or things where families are more comfortable rather than a more kind of research-based methodology. We're submitting the needs assessment to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we're sharing the PDG work with existing stakeholder groups, as Ian mentioned, and incorporating their feedback. We envision both the needs assessment and the strategic plan to be living documents that are going to be adapted certainly as soon as we are able to get the data from the data use licensing agreement and do the data analytics. I'm working on drafting the strategic plan, again, making sure that it's in alignment with EEC strategic planning. And receiving feedback on the strategic plan from this very board and other stakeholder groups to incorporating the feedback, and then developing the project plans and governance structure for the renewal grant pending the award.
There's also a lot of more detail in the appendix, and happy to share any other information that you'd find helpful at any point, and most importantly, just stress that while we're a little late coming to this table, I am not known for being on time. That's not for any lack of interest or willingness, I think, and necessity really for us to engage with stakeholders and with the board. It was more just the need to pull our state staff together first and make sure that we were working together as a team, and really, again, want to stress and thank all of the folks from those agencies who have worked really hard over the last 9 months or so to bring this thinking together as a team and really put together a solid plan, and know that we've got to do a lot more stakeholder engagement to put more of the meat on the bones of that plan.
Thank you. What's your timeline on the strategic plan and our feedback? I'm just thinking about our next few months.
Yeah. So
when do you hear about the renewal?
We should hear about the renewal in January. I'm not sure exactly when in January. It is a competitive grant, although we have, I hope, a pretty good chance of maybe just getting less than we've asked for as opposed to nothing what we've asked for. I think that the intent of the federal government is to try to give every state that makes above a certain cut score a certain amount. The strategic plan is very much in a draft form right now, and we need to, actually, the meeting that we were supposed to have to discuss that was today, right now. So we'll have that meeting probably, I think it's on the calendar as of today, for next week, and try to finalize it in the January, February timeframe, and would look to you and the commissioner to understand when it's best to bring that back to the board.
Okay, great. Look forward to it.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thanks for your flexibility, and look forward to the ongoing conversation.
Thank you, likewise.
I think it is a solo Dave left on the phone. Thank you for hanging in there, Dave. Thanks to everybody for coming today. Nikki, welcome again. Very much looking forward to a really robust 2020 together. We have lots in the hopper, and we have lots of great work early in the new year. So best wishes to everybody if we're not in touch before the new year. Thank you. Take care.